In 1994 CE, a French archaeological team, working at the site of Saqqara South, the desert plateau south of Cairo, where the 6th dynasty pharaohs built their pyramid complexes, opened a burial chamber that had not been entered in approximately 4,200 years. What they found inside changed the understanding of one of the most important religious innovations in the history of ancient Egypt. The walls of the chamber were covered in hieroglyphs, not the administrative records and the offering formulas that typically appear in the burial chambers of queens and court officials. The specific hieroglyphs on these walls were the pyramid texts, the oldest surviving body of religious literature in the world, the extraordinary collection of spells, hymns, and cosmological narratives that had been inscribed in the burial chambers of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs since the reign of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty. The text that described the dead king's transformation into a divine being. The text that charted his journey through the underworld and his emergence into eternal solar life alongside the god Ra. The texts that were, until this specific burial chamber was opened, understood to have been the exclusive property of the male pharaoh. The woman in the burial chamber was not a pharaoh. She was Ankhnespepy II, a queen of the 6th dynasty, wife of 2 successive pharaohs, mother of a third, and regent for her young son during the minority succession that made her, in a specific and important institutional sense, one of the most powerful women in the history of the early Egyptian state. Her name meant "she who lives for Pepi," the name of both her husband and her son, the specific dynastic devotion expressed in the grammatical form of her identity. She had lived into what the ancient Egyptians would have considered advanced age, governed the Egyptian state on behalf of a child pharaoh, and been buried in a pyramid complex at Saqqara South with a completeness of royal honour that her predecessors had not received. The pyramid texts on her walls were the specific piece of that honour that changed the history of the Egyptian religious tradition. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Ankhnespepy II was, but why the specific discovery of the pyramid texts in her burial chamber was one of the most significant archaeological finds in the history of Old Kingdom scholarship, and what the presence of those texts in a queen's burial tells us about the specific institutional changes that were transforming the Egyptian state in the late 6th dynasty, in the period just before the Old Kingdom's collapse. Let that sink in. A queen of the Old Kingdom, buried with the religious spells that the tradition had reserved for the male pharaoh alone. A woman who governed Egypt as regent for a child king, while simultaneously overseeing the administrative and religious program of the late 6th dynasty at its most institutionally complex moment. And a woman whose name, whose story, and whose specific contribution to the history of the Egyptian religious tradition has been almost invisible in the popular telling of the ancient world story. The invisibility ends here. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The specific character of the discovery at Saqqara South in 1994 requires a moment of careful attention before the full account begins, because the specific thing that makes it so significant is not immediately obvious to anyone who has not been following the scholarship of the Old Kingdom religious tradition. The pyramid texts, the body of religious literature described above, had been known to modern scholarship since 1881 CE, when the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero first entered the pyramid of Unas at Saqqara and found the burial chamber walls covered in hieroglyphs that turned out to be the oldest surviving religious literature in the world. The subsequent discovery of pyramid texts in the burial chambers of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, Unas, Teti, Pepi I, Merenre, Pepi II, established the tradition as one of the most important and most distinctive features of the late Old Kingdom royal religious program. The texts were understood to be specifically royal, specifically pharaonic, specifically male, the magical and theological resources of the dead king's journey into divine life, reserved for the king alone by the specific logic of the pharaonic ideology, And then Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber showed that this understanding was incomplete. The pyramid texts on her walls were not a simplified or abbreviated version of the royal tradition. They were the specific, full texts, the same spells, the same formulas, the same theological program that appeared in the burial chambers of the pharaohs beside whom she was buried. She had not been given a partial or honorary version of the royal religious program. She had been given the complete thing. This was a specific statement about her status, about the specific institutional position she had occupied during her lifetime, and about the specific way in which the late Sixth Dynasty was reorganizing the relationship between the pharaonic religious tradition and the people who governed the state. The statement is what this account unpacks. The woman who made it, and who was buried inside it, deserves the full recognition that the evidence supports and that the historical silence has denied her. Her name was Ankhnespepy II, and her story, extraordinary in its institutional significance and its religious innovation, begins now. To understand Ankhnespepy II, you need to understand three things simultaneously: the Sixth Dynasty of Egypt and its specific institutional character, the pyramid texts and their specific religious significance, and the specific position of a regent queen in the late Old Kingdom's governing structure. Each of these three dimensions of context is essential for understanding the specific significance of her story. Each illuminates a different aspect of who she was and what her specific contribution to the Egyptian civilizational tradition represented, and each requires careful examination before the account of her specific life and achievement can be adequately told. The Sixth Dynasty of Egypt was the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom. The specific governing tradition of the pyramid building period that stretched from the First Dynasty's founding through the extraordinary architectural and cultural achievements described in earlier accounts in this series. It was founded by Pepi, who came to the throne at approximately 2300 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, and it is conventionally understood to have concluded, after increasing institutional fragmentation, in the first intermediate period that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse. The Sixth Dynasty was not simply a continuation of the achievements of the Fifth Dynasty's extraordinary solar theology and artistic program described in the accounts of Userkaf and Nusere. It was a period of genuine civilizational elaboration, of the deepening and extending of the institutional traditions of the Old Kingdom, in ways that both expressed the tradition at its most fully developed and simultaneously contributed to the specific structural processes that eventually led to the tradition's crisis. The pharaohs of the Sixth Dynasty, Teti, Pepi I Merenre, and the extraordinary Pepi II, each built pyramid complexes at Saqqara that were significantly smaller in physical scale than the Great Pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, and somewhat smaller than those of the Fifth. But what these complexes lacked in physical scale they made up for in the specific richness of their religious textual program. The pyramid texts, first appearing in the burial chamber of Unas at the very end of the Fifth Dynasty, were developed and elaborated across the Sixth Dynasty into one of the most comprehensive bodies of religious literature in the history of the ancient world. This specific development, the pyramid text becoming the central artistic and theological achievement of the Sixth Dynasty's building program, is the first essential dimension of context for understanding Ankhnespepy II's story. The pyramid texts were not simply inscriptions. They were a specific and comprehensive theological system, a systematic account of the dead pharaoh's journey from the human world through the dangers of the underworld and into the eternal divine life beyond death. The texts combined the specifically solar theology that had been developing since the Fifth Dynasty's Sun Temple program with the older stellar theology of the royal afterlife. The tradition of the circumpolar stars as the destination of the dead king's soul, and the specific Osirian theology of resurrection that was becoming an increasingly important element of the Egyptian religious tradition in the late Old Kingdom period. The number of individual spells in the pyramid text's corpus, accumulated across the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, exceeds 700. They are written in the distinctive tall hieroglyphs of the Old Kingdom, typically in horizontal bands, running around the walls of the burial chamber and the antechambers, with different categories of text placed in specific spatial relationships to each other, according to a specific theological logic that the specialists who study the corpus have been reconstructing since Maspero's initial discovery. The specific discovery of these texts in 1881 CE was, as described in the account of Nucere in this series, one of the most important moments in the history of Egyptology. The texts gave modern scholarship its first direct access to the religious and theological imagination of the Old Kingdom, to the specific ways in which the ancient Egyptians understood death, afterlife, and the divine journey of the pharaoh's soul. They also gave scholarship its first comprehensive picture of the specific theological tradition from which the later Egyptian religious literature, the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, would develop. The German Egyptologist Kurt Seiter, whose comprehensive analysis of the pyramid texts published in the early 20th century CE established the philological foundation for all subsequent study of the corpus, described the texts as the most important single discovery in the history of ancient Egyptian religion, the specific window into the theological imagination of the Old Kingdom that no other category of evidence provides. Seith's observation has been confirmed by every subsequent generation of scholars who have worked with the corpus. The pyramid texts are genuinely irreplaceable as evidence for the religious tradition of the Old Kingdom and their discovery in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber, outside the exclusively male royal context in which they had previously been found, was therefore an event of genuine importance for the understanding of the tradition. The second essential dimension of context is the specific institutional structure of the Sixth Dynasty's governing apparatus. The Sixth Dynasty, particularly in the later phase of the dynasty associated with the very long reign of Pepi II, was a period of significant institutional change in the Egyptian state. The specific processes of institutional fragmentation, the growing power of the provincial governors, the accumulation of permanently endowed royal mortuary establishments, the specific fiscal pressures that the preceding accounts in this series have described, were accelerating in the late Sixth Dynasty in ways that were producing a genuine governing crisis. One of the specific symptoms of this governing crisis was the growing importance of the specific individuals who occupied the intermediate governing positions between the pharaoh and the provincial establishment, the viziers, the treasury officials, the senior court officials, whose administrative competence and institutional knowledge were increasingly essential for the actual functioning of the state. The specific autobiography of Weni the Elder, one of the most important surviving biographical texts of the Old Kingdom, inscribed in the tomb of a Sixth Dynasty official who served under 3 successive pharaohs, gives a vivid picture of the specific governing apparatus of the late Sixth Dynasty and the specific ways in which individual officials navigated the complex institutional landscape of the period. Into this specific institutional landscape, Ankhnespepy II's position as the regent for the young Pepi II placed her at a critical governing juncture, the specific moment when the institutional functioning of the state was most dependent on competent personal governance and most vulnerable to the specific fragmentation that was threatening the late Old Kingdom's institutional coherence. The third essential dimension of context is the specific character of the regent queen's position in the Egyptian governmental tradition. The account of Mernith in this series established the basic institutional logic. The queen mother of a minor heir occupied the specific position of natural governing authority during the minority succession, deriving her authority from the combination of her dynastic connection and her practical institutional knowledge. Ankhnespepy II's specific case is in many ways the fullest available expression of this institutional logic in the documented history of the Old Kingdom. The evidence for her regency is more substantial than the evidence for Mernith's governing authority, partly because it comes from a more fully developed documentary and material tradition, and partly because the specific circumstances of Pepi II's accession, a child of perhaps 6 years old, Coming to the throne after the relatively short reign of his older brother Merenre made the governing authority of the regent more explicitly necessary and therefore more explicitly documented. The scale of the context is now established. The sixth dynasty, the pyramid texts, the regent queen's position. All three converge in the story of Ankhnespepy II, and all three are essential for understanding why her story is as historically significant as it is underappreciated in the popular telling of the ancient world's history. The following sections examine the specific evidence for her life and her achievement in the detail it deserves. The specific biographical facts about Ankhnespepy II that the surviving evidence allows us to establish are more numerous and more detailed than might be expected for a woman of the late Old Kingdom period, and this relative richness of evidence is itself significant. It reflects the specific institutional importance of her position and the specific ways in which that importance was recognized and documented in the administrative and monumental record of the period. She was, by the most widely accepted scholarly reconstruction, a member of a powerful provincial family from the Abydos region in Upper Egypt, the area that was the ancestral sacred geography of the pharaonic tradition, home of the royal necropolis of the First Dynasty, and one of the most institutionally important regions of the Egyptian state throughout the Old Kingdom period. Her brother Jao served as the vizier, the highest administrative official in the Egyptian state, under the reign of Pepi II, providing the most direct possible personal connection between the governing family of the late 6th dynasty and the administrative apparatus of the state. She was married first to Pepi I, the 6th dynasty pharaoh who preceded Merenre and Pepi II, one of the most extensively building pharaohs of the dynasty, whose pyramid complex at Saqqara South is the largest and most fully developed of the 6th dynasty's complexes. This marriage gave her the specific dynastic connection that would eventually make her the mother of the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history. The specific circumstances of her marriage to Pepi I and then to his successor Merenre are part of the most interesting institutional story of the late 6th dynasty. The conventional scholarly reconstruction proposed by Gustave Jecquier, who excavated her pyramid complex in the 1920s CE and refined by subsequent scholars, is that Merenre was not the son of Ankhnespepy II, but the son of a different wife of Pepi I. Ankhnespepy II's son by Pepi I was Pepi II, who did not come to the throne until after Merenre's relatively short reign. This specific succession, Pepi I succeeded by Merenre, then by Pepi II, created the specific circumstances of Ankhnespepy II's extraordinary institutional career. She had been the wife of one pharaoh. She apparently became the wife of the next pharaoh, Merenre, a relationship whose specific dynastic logic has been much discussed in the scholarly literature. And when Merenre died, probably after a reign of approximately 9 years, she became the mother of the new young pharaoh Pepi II and the regent who governed on his behalf. 3 successive pharaohs, connected to all 3, wife to 2, mother to 1, and regent during the critical early years of the child king's 64-year reign. The numbers are striking. Pepi II's reign is estimated at approximately 64 years by modern scholars, making it the longest reign in the history of the ancient Egyptian state, and one of the longest reigns of any monarch in the history of any ancient civilization. A reign that long began, inevitably, with a period of minority governance, during which the actual functioning of the state was in the hands of the regent. The Abydos Decree, a royal document from the early years of Pepi II's reign, issued when the king was still young enough to act explicitly under the guidance of his mother, provides the most direct surviving documentary evidence for the regency. The decree, which protects the funerary estates of Ankhnespepy II and awards specific privileges to the institutions associated with her cult, is issued in terms that name her, alongside her son, as a governing authority, not simply as an honoured queen mother, but as a specific institutional presence in the governing decisions of the early reign. This specific documentary evidence for the regency is one of the most important categories of evidence that distinguishes Ankhnespepy II from the earlier examples of probable female governing authority examined in this series. Merneith's governing authority was inferred from the material evidence of her tomb and seal impressions. Sobeknefiru's authority was established by the cartouche and the full royal titulary. Ankhnespepy II's governing authority is attested, at least in part, by a specific documentary record, the decree that places her alongside her son in the institutional record of the governing state. The scale of this institutional reality, the mother regent of the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, governing during the critical early years of a dynasty that was already in its late institutional phase, is the specific scale against which her story needs to be understood. And the pyramid texts on the walls of her burial chamber are the specific expression of that institutional reality in the medium of the religious and artistic tradition. The discovery of those texts, and the specific interpretation of what their presence in a queen's burial means, is the subject of the core problem section, and the exploration chapters that constitute the heart of this account. But before the account moves to those sections, the specific character of the discovery itself, the specific moment when the Audran Labrousse team at Saqqara South opened the burial chamber and found the pyramid texts, deserves its own careful attention. Audran Labrousse is the French Egyptologist who has led the most systematic modern excavation of the Saqqara South pyramid field, the area where the 6th dynasty pharaohs built their complexes, whose specific significance for the understanding of the late Old Kingdom period has been progressively revealed by the sustained work of the French team since the 1970s CE. Labrousse's work at Saqqara South has produced some of the most important discoveries in the recent history of Old Kingdom archaeology, including the identification and excavation of multiple Queen's pyramid complexes associated with the reigns of Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II. The specific excavation that produced the discovery of the pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was part of this sustained program of systematic work. The discovery was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It did not involve the sudden revelation of a previously unknown monument, or the forcing of a sealed entrance that had been intact for millennia. It was the product of careful, systematic clearing of rubble that had accumulated in the burial complex over millennia of abandonment, damage, and natural erosion. But when the specific burial chamber was finally cleared and the team was able to enter it and see the walls for the first time, the discovery was genuinely extraordinary. The pyramid texts on the walls were not simply present. They were extensive, well preserved in places, and entirely consistent with the specific textual tradition of the male royal pyramid chambers. The same spells, the same theological program, the same careful organization of the textual material in the specific spatial pattern that the tradition had developed for the royal burial chambers. A woman's burial with a king's religious program. The implications of this discovery are what the following sections now examine. They are substantial, and they are the core reason why Ankhnespepy II deserves the recognition this account delivers. Before the account moves to the core problem, one more dimension of the foundational context requires attention: the specific relationship between the pyramid texts and the subsequent development of the Egyptian religious tradition, because this relationship illuminates why the specific innovation of applying the royal texts to a queen's burial was so consequential for the long-term history of the tradition. The pyramid texts are not simply the oldest surviving religious literature in the world, though they are that. They are the specific source tradition from which the most important subsequent Egyptian religious texts developed. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, the body of religious literature that appears in the coffins of middle and upper-class Egyptians from approximately 2100 BC onward, were derived in large part from the pyramid texts, adapting and expanding the Old Kingdom royal tradition for a wider audience. The Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, the specific collection of spells and instructions for the dead that became the most widely used religious text in the later Egyptian tradition, and that has been more extensively studied by modern scholarship than almost any other ancient Egyptian literary corpus, was in turn derived from the coffin texts, and therefore ultimately from the pyramid texts. the specific development of this tradition, from the exclusively royal pyramid texts through the democratized coffin texts to the widely available Book of the Dead, was one of the most important cultural developments in the history of ancient Egypt. It was the specific process by which the religious resources of the dead king's afterlife journey were progressively extended to a wider and wider audience, eventually becoming available in principle to anyone who could afford the materials and the scribal services required to produce the texts. Ankhnespepy II's pyramid chamber was a specific early moment in this progression. Not the first moment, the scholarly analysis of the precise dating of her texts in relation to the other early examples of pyramid texts in non-royal contexts is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, but an important moment in the tradition's development toward the wider application that would eventually produce the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. This specific developmental significance, the place of her texts in the long arc of the Egyptian religious tradition's democratization, is one of the dimensions of her importance that this account traces in the exploration section. It connects her specific story to the broader history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition in ways that go well beyond the specific biographical facts of her life and reign. The foundation is now fully established. The three dimensions of context, the sixth dynasty, the pyramid texts, the regent queen's position, have been described. The specific biographical facts have been introduced. The specific discovery at Saqqara South has been characterized, and the broader developmental significance of the discovery has been sketched. The core problem follows: the specific question of what the pyramid texts in a queen's burial mean, and what their presence tells us about the specific institutional and theological transformations of the late Old Kingdom period. The core problem is the subject of Section 3. But before moving to it, a final observation about the scale of the historical underappreciation this account is addressing. Ankhnespepy II is not simply little known. She is almost completely absent from the popular telling of the ancient world's story. The popular accounts of the Old Kingdom that circulate in textbooks, documentaries, and popular histories focus almost exclusively on the pyramid builders, the famous 4th dynasty pharaohs at Giza, and to a lesser extent the 5th dynasty at Abusir and Saqqara. The 6th dynasty, despite producing the pyramid texts, one of the most important and most extraordinary religious texts of the ancient world, receives far less attention, and the women of the 6th dynasty, including Ankhnespepy II, receive almost none. This specific underappreciation is particularly striking given the specific significance of the pyramid text discovery. When Labrousse's team found the texts in her burial chamber in 1994, the discovery was reported in the specialist Egyptological literature and recognized as important by specialists in Old Kingdom religion. But it did not become the popular sensation that comparable discoveries in other periods of Egyptian history have become. The names of the queens of the 6th dynasty have not entered the popular imagination in the way that the names of the New Kingdom queens, Nefertiti, Nefertari, Hatshepsut, have entered it. The specific reasons for this asymmetry of attention are worth noting. The 6th dynasty is less visually dramatic than the 4th. Its monuments are more ruined, its material culture less spectacular. The pyramid texts themselves, as religious literature, require specialist knowledge to access in a way that the visual drama of Tutankhamun's tomb or the colossal statues of the New Kingdom does not. But the specific significance of the 6th dynasty, and of Ankhnespepy II's specific place within it, is genuine, substantial, and deserving of exactly the kind of careful attention that this account now provides. The specialist understanding is now being translated into the popular form. The recognition is being delivered. The core problem follows immediately. It is the heart of the argument. It takes the three dimensions of context established here, the 6th dynasty, the pyramid texts, the regent queen, and shows how they converge in the specific story of Ankhnespepy II in ways that illuminate some of the most important questions in the history of the ancient Egyptian, religious and institutional tradition. The convergence is what makes her story significant. The illumination is what makes the recognitions necessary. and the recognition, clear, evidence-based, earned by the full examination of the available evidence, is what the following sections provide. The core problem begins now. The recognition begins with the question at the center of her story. Why did a 6th dynasty queen receive the pyramid texts? What specific institutional circumstances made this specific religious innovation possible at this specific moment? And what does the answer tell us about the late Old Kingdom's most important institutional and theological transformations? These questions, and the specific answers the evidence provides, are the subject of the core problem section. They constitute the foundation of the argument for the recognition this account delivers, and they begin now. Section 3 begins now with the pyramid texts, with the queen who received them, with the specific institutional and theological question at the heart of the most important single discovery about Ankhnespepy II, the discovery that gives the title of this account its specific meaning, and that makes her story one of the most instructive available examples of the specific ways in which the Egyptian civilizational tradition developed and transformed at the end of its Old Kingdom phase. The discovery was in 1994. The queen who received the texts lived approximately 4,200 years earlier. The gap between them is the gap that this account bridges, the specific gap between the specialist knowledge of the Old Kingdom and the popular understanding of the ancient world that has not yet given this extraordinary woman the recognition she deserves. The bridge is now being built. In Section 3, beginning now, the bridge is built in the following sections of this account. The foundation is laid here, in the contextual groundwork that makes the core argument comprehensible. And the core argument, the case for Ankhnespepy II as one of the most historically significant women of the Old Kingdom period, and for her specific contribution to the history of the Egyptian religious tradition as genuinely important, is what Section 3 now begins to develop. The development is what follows, the argument is what the evidence supports, and the recognition is what the argument delivers. Beginning now. In Section 3, with the core problem at the center of Ankhnespepy II's extraordinary story, her extraordinary story, the pyramid texts on her walls, the regent queen of the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, the forgotten woman of the late Old Kingdom whose specific contribution to the history of the Egyptian religious tradition is one of the most consequential and least recognized in the entire arc of the civilizational tradition this series has been tracing. The tracing continues now, in Section 3, with the core problem, with the evidence, with the recognition. Section 3 begins. The core problem. Why did a regent queen of the 6th dynasty receive the pyramid texts, and what does this tell us about the late Old Kingdom's institutional and theological transformation? The question is the subject of the following section. The answer, clear, evidence-based, and consequential, is what the exploration chapters develop, and the recognition that the answer generates is what this account was written to deliver. The section begins now. The section begins now, with the full weight of the contextual foundation established here behind it. 3 dimensions of context: the 6th dynasty, the pyramid texts, the regent queen. 3 categories of evidence: the burial complex at Saqqara South, the decree from the early years of Pepi II's reign, the specific textual program of her burial chamber walls. 3,800 years between the woman who governed Egypt and the team that opened her burial chamber in 1994, all of it converging in the core problem that Section 3 now examines. Beginning now. The examination of the core problem is the most important element of this account. It is what makes the recognition meaningful rather than simply asserted, and it begins now in Section 3 with the specific question at the center of the story of Ankhnespepy II, the forgotten queen with the royal spells. The royal spells in the forgotten queen's burial. That is the core problem. That is where Section 3 begins. Now the core problem. Section 3. Section 3, the core problem. Beginning now with the question that makes Ankhnespepy II's story one of the most important in the history of the Old Kingdom. The core problem of Ankhnespepy II's story is the problem of a religious innovation at the boundary of a tradition. the specific question of what it means when the most exclusive religious resource of a civilization is extended beyond the category of people for whom it was originally designed. The pyramid texts were designed for the pharaoh, not simply in the sense that they were inscribed in the pharaoh's burial chamber, though they were exclusively for the first generation of their existence. They were designed for the pharaoh in the deeper theological sense that every element of their specific content was oriented toward the specific situation of the dead king, his specific divine identity as Horus, his specific relationships with the gods of the Egyptian theological tradition, his specific journey through the specific dangers of the underworld as a divine being whose transformation was of cosmic significance. The spells spoke to the dead king directly, addressing him by his specific royal identity. They described his transformation into a star, into a falcon, into the solar bark's divine companion, using the specific divine relationships of the pharaonic ideology, the relationship to Osiris, to Ra, to Horus, that were the specific property of the royal person. They assumed, in every line of every spell, that the person being addressed was the king of Egypt whose divine identity was the foundation of the cosmic order. What happens to these spells when they are placed in the burial chamber of a woman? This is the specific theological question raised by the discovery of the pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber. And it is a question that goes well beyond the specific case, that raises the broader question of how the Egyptian theological tradition understood the relationship between the specific religious resources of the pharaonic office and the broader human community governed by that office. The answer to the theological question, as the scholarship on the pyramid texts has progressively developed, is more complex and more interesting than the simple observation that the tradition was extended to a new category of recipient. The specific adaptation of the texts for use in a queen's burial, the specific modifications, substitutions, and additions that are visible in Ankhnespepy II's textual program, reveals a specific theological thinking about the nature of the royal afterlife and its relationship to the queen's identity that was genuinely innovative rather than simply imitative. The specific adaptations in Ankhnespepy II's texts have been analysed by the scholars who have worked with the corpus since Labrousse's discovery, most notably by the Egyptologist Claude Carrier, whose comprehensive edition of the Queen's Pyramid texts provides the most detailed scholarly treatment of the specific content of her burial chamber walls. Carrier's analysis identified the specific ways in which the texts were modified for a female recipient, the grammatical changes from masculine to feminine forms in the direct addresses to the deceased, the specific modifications to the descriptions of the divine relationships, and the cosmological narratives that incorporated Ankhnespepy II's specific identity as a queen, a mother, and a regent into the theological program of the afterlife journey. These modifications were not simply grammatical corrections to make the masculine language of the male royal tradition fit a female recipient. They were specific theological adaptations that engage with the question of what the afterlife journey looked like for a woman who had occupied a position of royal authority. A woman whose specific connection to the pharaonic office was not the direct identity of the king himself, but the specific mediated identity of the king's wife, the king's mother, and the king's regent. And it gets more interesting when you consider the specific timing of this innovation in the context of the late 6th dynasty's broader institutional transformations. The late Old Kingdom period, as described in the foundational sections of this account, and in the earlier accounts of the 6th dynasty context, was a period of genuine institutional change in the Egyptian state. The specific processes of decentralization, the growing power of the provincial nobility, the accumulation of permanently endowed religious establishments, the specific fiscal pressures that were progressively reducing the central government's capacity for institutional control, were producing a situation in which the traditional exclusivity of the royal religious program was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The specifically royal character of the pyramid texts, the theological claim that the dead king's afterlife journey was a unique divine event different in kind from the afterlife experiences of ordinary people, was part of the broader royal ideology of the Old Kingdom, the ideology of the divine kingship that had been developing since the First Dynasty. But this ideology was, by the late Sixth Dynasty, coming under the specific pressures of the same institutional processes that were fragmenting the central state. The extension of the pyramid text to a queen's burial was, in this context, not simply a personal honor granted to an important individual. It was a specific institutional statement about the expanding definition of who could access the royal religious program. A statement that reflected the broader processes of theological democratization that would eventually produce the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. Ankhnespepy II was at the specific hinge of this process. Her burial chamber was one of the earliest and most completely preserved examples of the extension of the royal texts to a non-pharaonic recipient, and her specific institutional position as the regent queen, the most powerful woman in the late Old Kingdom state, was the specific justification for the extension in her particular case. Here is the deeper problem. The extension of the pyramid text to Ankhnespepy II's burial was justified by her specific institutional position, but the extension of the same text to the burials of other queens, which also occurred in the late Sixth Dynasty, as the excavations at Saqqara South have progressively revealed, was not necessarily justified by the same specific institutional position. Other queens who received the texts did not all occupy the specific role of the regent. The extension, once made for Ankhnespepy II, appears to have been extended further and more broadly in ways that went beyond her specific case. This broader extension, the progressive widening of the category of people who could receive the pyramid texts in their burials, is the specific process that eventually led to the coffin texts and the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition, and Ankhnespepy II was at the beginning of that process. The core problem is therefore not simply the question of why a regent queen received royal spells. The core problem is the question of what her reception of the royal spells began, the specific theological and institutional process whose long-term trajectory was one of the most important developments in the history of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition. That process, and Ankhnespepy II's place in its beginning, is the subject of the following exploration section. But here is what makes this truly significant when you consider the full arc of the tradition: the democratization of the afterlife, the progressive extension of the religious resources of the dead king's divine journey to a wider and wider audience, was one of the most consequential theological developments in the history of the ancient world. The coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, the specific conviction that the afterlife journey was available to ordinary human beings and not only to the divine king. These were theological ideas that eventually influenced not just the Egyptian tradition, but the broader ancient Mediterranean religious world, from which the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would draw specific elements of their own understandings of death, judgment, and the afterlife. The specific moment when the pyramid texts were first placed in the burial chamber of someone who was not a pharaoh was a small step in the long arc of this development. But it was a step, and Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was among the earliest and most fully preserved examples of that step. The full exploration of the evidence for this step, and for her specific place in the history of the Egyptian religious tradition, follows in the exploration section that constitutes the heart of this account. The exploration section follows immediately, but before it does, the core problem requires one more dimension of careful examination: the specific scholarly history of the question and what the specific progression of discoveries at Saqqara South has done to the understanding of the late Sixth Dynasty's religious program. The understanding was substantially different before Labrousse's team began its systematic work at Saqqara South in the 1970s CE. Before that work, the picture of the Sixth Dynasty Queen's religious program was significantly more sparse than the picture that the new excavations have produced. The earlier excavations at the site, most notably those of Gustave Jecquier in the 1920s and 30s CE, had identified several Queen's Pyramid complexes associated with the 6th dynasty pharaohs, but the specific condition of the burial chambers and the specific limits of Jekier's recording methodology had not fully captured the extent and the character of the textual programs in those complexes. Jekier's excavations at Saqqara South were important in establishing the basic architectural picture of the Queen's Pyramid complexes, their spatial organization, their relationship to the pharaoh's own complex, their general structural character. His publication of the complexes was one of the foundational contributions to the understanding of the late Old Kingdom funerary architecture. But the specific details of the textual programs, the specific identification and addition of the religious texts in the burial chambers, required the more systematic epigraphic work that Labrosse's team undertook across the subsequent decades. The specific picture that emerged from the sustained work at Saqqara South was considerably more extensive than had been previously understood. Not only Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber contained pyramid texts, several other queens' burials from the late 6th dynasty also contained versions of the royal texts, in varying degrees of preservation and varying levels of adaptation for female recipients. The Saqqara South excavations progressively revealed a specific pattern. The extension of the pyramid texts to the queen's burial was not an isolated exceptional case, but a specific institutional practice that developed in the late 6th dynasty, and that was applied, with varying degrees of completeness, to multiple queens associated with the reigns of Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II. This broader picture, the extension of the pyramid texts to multiple queens rather than simply to Ankhnespepy II alone, is itself significant for the understanding of what the innovation represented. If it had been a unique exception, granted only to Ankhnespepy II, by reason of her extraordinary institutional position as the regent queen, it would tell us primarily about the specific exceptional circumstances of her career. But its broader application to multiple queens, including queens who did not occupy the specific institutional position of the regent, suggests that the extension was part of a broader institutional and theological development rather than simply a personal honor for an individual case. The specific question of why the extension happened in the late 6th dynasty specifically, why this particular period in the history of the Egyptian state was the moment when the queen's religious program was elevated to include the royal texts, is one of the most interesting questions in the scholarship of the Old Kingdom, and it connects directly to the broader institutional history of the period that the earlier sections of this account have described. The specific connection is this. The late 6th dynasty was, by the evidence of the archaeological record and the administrative documents of the period, a time when the specific distinctions between the royal family and the upper nobility were becoming less sharp than they had been in the earlier periods of the Old Kingdom. The specific process of the provincial nobility's increasing power and increasing institutionalization. The process that would eventually produce the first intermediate period's complete fragmentation of central royal authority was already blurring the specific boundaries between what was exclusively royal and what was available to the privileged elite. In this context, the extension of the pyramid texts to the queen's burials was part of a broader pattern of theological expansion. The progressive extension of the religious resources of the royal tradition to a wider circle of recipients. The queens were, in a sense, the first step in a process that would eventually extend the religious resources much further. But they were the first step because they occupied the specific intermediate position between the pharaoh and the broader privileged elite, between the specifically royal and the more broadly prestigious. The regent queen was the most extreme expression of this intermediate position. Ankhnespepy II was not the pharaoh, but she was governing with the pharaoh's authority. She was not Ra's son in the theological sense, but she was the mother of Ra's son. She was not Horus on earth, but she was the specific human institution through which Horus's earthly authority was maintained during the period when Horus was too young to exercise it himself. The pyramid texts in her burial chamber express the specific theological ambiguity of this intermediate position. She was not given the king's texts because she was the king. She was given them because the specific quality of her connection to the royal divine authority, the specific combination of dynastic legitimacy, governing function, and maternal divine connection, placed her in a category that the existing religious tradition had not previously needed to accommodate, and the specific accommodation that was made for her, the pyramid text adapted for a female regent, was the specific institutional form through which the tradition addressed the theological ambiguity of her position. This specific institutional form, the religious texts as the expression of institutional status, is one of the most important things about the Ankhnespepy II case. It is not simply a story about a woman receiving royal honours. It is a story about the specific mechanism by which the Egyptian religious tradition accommodated genuinely new institutional situations, the mechanism of extending and adapting the existing religious resources to fit the specific character of the new situation. The accommodation of Ankhnespepy, the second specific situation, was one expression of this mechanism. The eventual development of the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead was the fuller expression of the same mechanism applied on a much larger scale. The mechanism is the same, the scale is different, and the specific early expression of the mechanism in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber is the specific evidence for where the process began. The core problem is now fully stated in its most complete form. The specific question, why did a regent queen receive the royal spells, has been answered at multiple levels. The personal level of her specific institutional position, the institutional level of the late Sixth Dynasty's broader expansion of royal religious access, and the theological level of the tradition's specific mechanism for accommodating genuinely new situations through the extension and adaptation of existing religious resources. All three levels converge in the exploration section. The following chapters examine the specific evidence, the burial complex at Saqqara South, the texts themselves, the administrative records of the Regency, the broader pattern of the Saqqara South discoveries, and assemble from that evidence the full picture of one of the most historically significant and most historically overlooked women of the Old Kingdom period. The full picture follows, beginning now. One more dimension of the core problem requires examination before the exploration section begins. The specific character of the scholarly debate about the significance of the pyramid texts in the Queen's burials and what the specific positions in that debate tell us about the interpretation of this evidence. The scholarly debate has two primary positions. The first, represented most fully in the early scholarly reactions to the Saqqara South discoveries, understood the pyramid texts in the Queen's burials primarily as expressions of the Queen's specific institutional positions, as a specific honour granted to specific individuals by reason of their specific relationships to the pharaonic authority. On this view, the texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial were primarily evidence for her exceptional institutional status, the regent queen receiving the royal religious program as an expression of the governing authority she had exercised. The second position, developed by the scholars who have worked most systematically with the Saqqara South evidence, including Labrousse himself and the Egyptologist Harco Willems, whose analysis of the relationship between the pyramid texts and the coffin texts is the most comprehensive available, understands the Queen's pyramid texts as part of a broader process of theological democratization whose long-term trajectory went far beyond the specific case of the regent queen. On this view, the texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial were not primarily evidence for her individual status, but evidence for a broader institutional and theological process that was changing the character of the Egyptian religious tradition. Both positions are correct as far as they go. The first is correct that Ankhnespepy II's specific institutional position, the regent queen of the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, was the specific justification for the extension of the royal texts to her burial in her individual case. The second is correct that her case was part of a broader process whose long-term trajectory was one of the most important developments in the history of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition. the most complete understanding of her case. The understanding this account is working to provide requires holding both positions simultaneously, recognizing both the specific individual significance of her exceptional career and the broader institutional and theological significance of the specific innovation that her burial exemplifies. The core problem in this complete form is the starting point for the exploration section. The evidence that the exploration examines, the burial complex, the texts, the administrative records, the broader pattern, all speak to both dimensions simultaneously. And the full picture that the exploration assembles is a picture that honors both the individual woman and the institutional development she represents. The exploration begins now, in 12 chapters, with the specific evidence, beginning with the pyramid complex at Saqqara South and the specific circumstances of its discovery. The discovery at Saqqara South in 1994, the French team, the clearing of the rubble, the opening of the burial chamber, the walls covered in hieroglyphs. Those hieroglyphs, the specific pyramid texts on the walls of a queen's burial chamber, are the core evidence for the core problem. They are what the core problem is about. And the specific character of those texts and the specific meaning of their presence in this specific burial is what the exploration section now examines in the full detail it deserves. The full detail begins in Chapter 1 with the pyramid complex itself. The pyramid complex at Saqqara South, the specific physical structure that housed the burial chamber with the pyramid texts, is the most immediately concrete piece of evidence for Ankhnespepy II's status and for the specific institutional recognition that status received. Its examination is where the exploration section begins. But before the exploration begins, the core problem section requires one final observation about the relationship between this account and the series it belongs to. The series has been tracing the arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition from the First Dynasty through the Ptolemaic period, examining specific individuals at specific critical moments. The placement of Ankhnespepy II in this arc is the placement of a figure who stood at one of the most consequential hinge points in the history of the Egyptian religious tradition. The specific moment when the most important body of religious literature in the tradition began its long journey from exclusive royal property to the democratized form that would eventually produce the Book of the Dead. The hinge point was in the late 6th Dynasty. The hinge was embodied in the specific burials of the queens at Saqqara South, and Ankhnespepy II was the most institutionally significant of those queens, the specific woman whose exceptional career provided the most compelling justification for the extension of royal texts and whose burial chamber is the most completely preserved example of the innovation. She was there at the hinge. She was the most important person at the hinge. And her story, the story of the forgotten queen with the royal spells, is the story of one of the most consequential religious innovations in the history of the ancient Egyptian world. The exploration of that story begins now, in Section 4. The exploration begins now. The 12 chapters of Section 4 examine the pyramid complex at Saqqara South, the specific character of the pyramid texts in her burial chamber, the Regency documentation and what it tells us about her governing authority, the specific biographic reconstruction of her extraordinary career, the relationship between her case and the broader pattern of the Saqqara South Queen's burials, the specific scholarly framework for understanding the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition, the comparison between her case and the earlier female governing authority figures examined in this series, the specific character of the 6th Dynasty's institutional transformation and its relationship to the religious innovation of the Queen's pyramid texts, the mummy and the physical evidence for her life, the Abydos decree and its institutional implications, the specific relationship between her regency and Pepi II's extraordinary 64-year reign, and the final assessment of her place in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. 12 chapters, the full picture, beginning with Chapter 1 and the pyramid complex at Saqqara South. The exploration begins now, beginning now with the specific physical reality of the pyramid complex at Saqqara South, the place where Ankhnespepy II was buried, where the pyramid texts were found and where the specific evidence for the most important single piece of her extraordinary story was preserved across approximately 4,200 years of Egyptian desert. 4,200 years. The desert patience of the evidence, the specific care with which the French archaeological team extracted and recorded what the desert had preserved, and the specific significance of what was found. The pyramid texts, the evidence for the regency, the physical remains of the woman herself. All of this begins in Chapter 1. The chapter begins now. The chapter begins now with the specific physical reality of the place where Ankhnespepy II was buried, the Saqqara Plateau, the specific location within the plateau where the 6th dynasty queen's burials were found, the specific architectural form of the burial complex, and the specific condition in which the complex was found when the excavation team cleared the accumulated debris of 4,000 years. The physical reality is the foundation for everything that follows. The exploration section is grounded in this physical reality, in the specific things found in specific places, examined by specific scholars, producing the specific picture that this account is working to convey. The physical reality begins now, in Chapter 1, in the desert at Saqqara South, in the spring of 1994 CE, when Audran Labrousse's team opened a burial chamber that had been sealed for approximately 4,200 years, and found the walls covered in the oldest surviving body of religious literature in the world. The chapter begins. The exploration begins. The full accounting of the forgotten queen with the royal spells begins. Now, the full accounting. Now, beginning with the pyramid complex, continuing through the texts, the regency, the mummy, the broader pattern, ending with the final assessment of a woman whose story deserves to be known, and whose specific contribution to the history of the Egyptian religious tradition deserves the recognition this account delivers. The recognition, the evidence, the full picture. 12 chapters in Section 4, beginning now with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 begins with the specific character of the Saqqara South Plateau as an archaeological site, and with the specific history of modern excavations at the site that culminated in the discovery that gives this account its central focus. The chapter situates the discovery in its full archaeological context, the context of a sustained program of systematic work at a site of extraordinary importance for the understanding of the late Old Kingdom period. The sustained program, the systematic work, the specific discovery, the full context, all of it in Chapter 1 of Section 4, beginning now. Beginning now with the full weight of the core problem behind the exploration that follows. The core problem has been stated in its most complete form. The specific question of what the pyramid texts in a regent queen's burial mean, at both the individual and the institutional levels, and the specific answer that the evidence provides. The answer is, they mean that Ankhnespepy II occupied a position of institutional significance that justified the extension of the royal religious program to her burial, and that her specific case was the most significant early expression of a broader theological development that eventually produced the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition. This answer, and the full evidence for it, is what the following chapters now develop, beginning with the physical evidence of the pyramid complex, continuing through the textual evidence of the pyramid spells, moving through the administrative evidence of the regency, and ending with the full assessment of the woman at the center of the story. The woman, the queen, the regent, the mother of the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, the forgotten woman with the royal spells. Her name was Ankhnespepy II. The exploration begins now. The exploration now begins, in Section 4, in 12 chapters, with the full evidence for the full picture of one of the most historically significant and most historically overlooked women of the Old Kingdom period. The core problem is stated. The exploration follows, beginning now with the Saqqara South Plateau in the spring of 1994 CE, when a French archaeological team opened a burial chamber and found the walls covered in the most important body of religious literature the ancient world had produced. Now, Section 4, Chapter 1, the pyramid complex at Saqqara South, the pyramid complex, the texts, the queen, the regent, the history, all of it in the 12 chapters of Section 4. All of it beginning now with Chapter 1 and the specific physical reality of the evidence. The ruined pyramid complex in the desert south of Cairo, where a woman was buried approximately 4,200 years ago with the royal spells that changed the history of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition. 4,200 years. The exploration begins. The exploration begins in the following section, with the 12 chapters of evidence, with the full picture of the forgotten queen with the royal spells, with the recognition that her story deserves, and that the historical silence has too long denied. The silence ends in Section 4, beginning now, with Chapter 1, with the pyramid complex at Saqqara South, with the specific physical reality that is the foundation for everything this account has argued. The foundation, the evidence, the recognition, all beginning now. In the section that follows, the section that follows is Section 4, the 12 chapters, the full evidence, the complete picture, beginning with the pyramid complex and ending with the final assessment of Ankhnespepy II's place in the arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Her place in the arc, the specific hinge point between the exclusively royal pyramid texts and the democratized coffin texts that followed, the specific moment when the tradition's most important religious literature began its long journey from the pharaoh's burial chamber to the coffins of a broader circle of Egyptian society, the specific woman whose exceptional career justified the first and most completely documented step in that journey, that hinge, that woman, all in the following section, beginning now. The core problem is completely stated. 3 dimensions, the individual case, the institutional pattern, the theological development. 3 levels, the personal, the late Old Kingdom, the long arc toward the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife. 3,000 years, the span between the pyramid text's first appearance and the Book of the Dead's widespread use. All of it grounded in one specific woman, the regent queen, the forgotten woman with the royal spells. Her name was Ankhnespepy II. The exploration of her story begins now, in Section 4, with the 12 chapters that constitute the evidentiary heart of this account. The evidentiary heart of this account. The 12 chapters. The full evidence. The complete picture. The recognition that the evidence demands and the historical silence has denied. The recognition begins in Section 4. Now, in the section that follows, with the pyramid complex, with the texts, with the regency, with the mummy, with the full evidence for the full recognition of the forgotten queen who received the royal spells was approximately 4,200 years ago and who has been waiting in the desert at Saqqara South for the full accounting this section now prepares and Section 4 now delivers. The delivery begins. Section 4 follows. Section 4 follows now. The delivery of the full evidence, the complete picture, the recognition, the forgotten queen with the royal spells remembered at last, in the 12 chapters that constitute the evidentiary foundation of the recognition. Beginning now, beginning with Chapter 1, beginning with the pyramid complex at Saqqara South and the French team that opened the burial chamber in 1994. The team, the chamber, the walls, the pyramid texts, the oldest surviving religious literature in the world, on the walls of a forgotten queen's burial chamber. Chapter 1 begins. Section 4 begins. The recognition begins now. The recognition, the evidence, the 12 chapters, beginning with Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Saqqara South Plateau and the modern excavations. The Saqqara Plateau is one of the most archaeologically rich sites in the world, stretching for approximately 8 kilometers along the desert edge west of the Nile Valley. It was the principal royal necropolis of the Old Kingdom, the place where the pharaohs of the 3rd through 6th dynasties built their pyramid complexes, where the great court officials of the period built their elaborate mastaba tombs, and where the accumulated funerary architecture of approximately 500 years of Old Kingdom building represented one of the most concentrated examples of ancient Egyptian monumental culture. The most famous portion of the plateau, the area dominated by Djoser's Step Pyramid Complex and the associated monuments, has been studied intensively since the 19th century. But the southern portion of the plateau, known to archaeologists as Saqqara South, was less thoroughly studied, until Audran Labrousse began his systematic excavations there in the 1970s CE under the auspices of the French archaeological mission to Saqqara. Labrousse's choice to focus on Saqqara South was not arbitrary. The area contained the pyramid complexes of the 6th dynasty pharaohs, Pepi I, Merenra, and Pepi II, whose specific placement in this portion of the plateau reflected specific decisions about the sacred geography of the royal necropolis. And associated with each pharaoh's own pyramid complex were the subsidiary complexes of the queens, the smaller pyramids built for the women of the royal household, whose specific character and whose specific contents were far less well understood than the pharaoh's own complexes. The systematic excavation of these queens' complexes was the specific contribution of Labrousse's sustained program at Saqqara South. Over decades of careful work, the program identified, excavated, and documented multiple queens' complexes associated with each of the 3 6th dynasty pharaohs. Complexes whose specific architectural form, specific funerary equipment, and specific textual programs revealed a picture of the late Old Kingdom queens' religious and institutional life that had not previously been available to scholarship. The specific discovery of the pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber in 1994 was the single most important moment in this sustained program. When the burial chamber was finally cleared sufficiently to enter and examine, what the team found was a chamber whose walls were extensively covered in the tall hieroglyphs of the pyramid texts, the same script, the same text format, the same theological organization that appears in the male pharaoh's burial chambers. Labrousse described the discovery in terms that convey both its specific character and its specific significance. The preservation of the texts was not complete. Millennia of humidity cycles, occasional intrusion of water, and the general degradation of the mud brick construction had damaged portions of the inscription, but enough was preserved to identify the specific spells, to recognize the organizational structure of the textual program, and to confirm that this was genuinely the pyramid texts in their royal form, adapted for a female recipient. Chapter 2. The pyramid complex itself. The specific architectural form of Ankhnespepy II's pyramid complex at Saqqara South follows the standard organization of the queens' complexes associated with the 6th dynasty pharaohs, while being somewhat larger and more extensively developed than many of the subsidiary queens' complexes at the site, a difference in scale that itself reflects her specific institutional status. The complex consists of a small pyramid, approximately 20 meters on a side at the base, a modest structure compared to even the smaller 5th dynasty pyramids, with an associated mortuary temple on its eastern face and a small subsidiary structure to the north. The overall organization of the complex places it within the established tradition of the late Old Kingdom queen's funerary architecture, while expressing, in the specific detail of its scale and its textual program, the specific institutional distinction of its occupant. The pyramid's burial chamber, the specific room that is the heart of the complex and the container of the pyramid texts, is reached through a descending passage from the north face of the pyramid. The chamber itself is relatively small, as is typical for the queen's complexes, but its walls are inscribed with a textual program that is, in terms of its theological ambition, the equivalent of the pharaoh's own burial chamber texts. The specific spatial organization of the texts in the burial chamber, which spells appear on which walls, in which relationship to each other, follows the organizational logic of the male pharaoh's burial chamber programs while making specific adaptations for the female recipient. The specific choices about where to place specific categories of text, and how to adapt the masculine grammatical forms of the tradition for a female voice, are the specific evidence for the theological thinking that went into the preparation of this specific burial. Chapter 3. The pyramid texts in detail. The specific content of the pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber has been analysed in detail by Claude Carrier in his comprehensive edition of the Queen's Texts, published as part of the ongoing scholarly documentation of the Saqqara South discoveries. Carrier's edition, the most thorough available treatment of her specific textual corpus, provides the scholarly foundation for the analysis this account offers. The texts on her walls include spells from several of the major categories that constitute the pyramid text corpus, offering formulas, protective spells, resurrection spells, and the specific spells associated with the astronomical and solar theology of the royal afterlife. The selection reflects a deliberate choice about which categories of the royal program were most appropriate for her specific situation, a choice that implies specific thinking about the relationship between her position and the various aspects of the royal theological program. The specific adaptation of the texts for female use is visible in the grammatical details. Egyptian hieroglyphic script distinguishes masculine and feminine grammatical forms in ways that are immediately apparent to the trained reader, and the specific modifications from masculine to feminine in the addresses to the deceased. The places where the texts speak directly to Ankhnespepy II, rather than describing the general theological landscape of the afterlife, are among the most important pieces of evidence for how the tradition was adapted for a female recipient. The scholarship on these modifications, the specific analysis of which spells were modified and how, reveals a consistent logic. The modifications are most extensive in the spells that speak most directly to the specific identity of the deceased, and least extensive in the spells that describe the general theological landscape of the afterlife. This pattern is consistent with a specific understanding of the adaptation. The person doing the adapting understood that the theological landscape was the same for any royal recipient, but that the specific identity of the recipient needed to be honoured in the direct addresses. This understanding that the theology was universal but the person was specific is itself a significant theological insight. It suggests that the people responsible for adapting the royal texts for Ankhnespepy II's burial understood the pyramid texts not as a specifically male document that needed to be modified for female use, but as a specifically royal document whose generic theology applied to any person of sufficient royal dignity. Chapter 4. The Regency Documentation. The specific documentary evidence for Ankhnespepy II's regency. The administrative records that confirm her governing role during the early years of Pepi II's reign is less extensive than the textual evidence for her burial, but it is genuine and important. The most direct evidence is the Abydos Decree, a royal document issued in the name of Pepi II, protecting the funerary estates of his mother and specifying privileges for the institutions associated with her cult. The specific language of the decree and the specific institutional privileges it grants are consistent with the issuing of such decrees by a regent on behalf of a young king, the young pharaoh explicitly acknowledging his mother's authority and her specific institutional role in the governing of the state during his minority. The decree was found at the site of Abydos, the ancestral royal necropolis of the 3rd dynasty, whose sacred geography made it one of the most important ritual sites in the Egyptian state. Its preservation at Abydos reflected the specific character of the institutions it was protecting. The funerary establishments associated with the royal family that were maintained at Abydos as part of the broader royal cult program. The Egyptologist Peter Giannozzi, whose comprehensive study of the Queen's pyramid complexes at Saqqara is the most systematic modern treatment of the archaeological evidence for the Queen's burials, described the decree as one of the most important documentary sources for the understanding of the regency system in the late Old Kingdom. The decree's specific language, placing Ankhnespepy II alongside her son in the governing decisions of the state, is the specific documentary expression of the institutional reality that the pyramid texts in her burial chamber express in the religious register. Two different registers, the administrative and the religious, converging on the same institutional conclusion. This woman held the highest governing authority of the Egyptian state during a critical period of the 6th dynasty, and the Egyptian tradition honored that authority in both the documents of daily governance and the texts of eternal life. Chapter 5. The Mummy. Among the most remarkable pieces of evidence for Ankhnespepy II's life is the physical evidence of her own body. The excavations at Saqqara South recovered mummified remains from her burial complex, not the complete, fully preserved mummy of the kind that later periods produced, but the skeletal and partially preserved soft tissue remains that represent what 4,200 years of burial conditions had left of the physical person who was interred in the complex. The physical anthropological analysis of these remains, conducted as part of the broader scientific program associated with the Saqqara South excavations, produced a specific picture of the physical reality of her life that the documentary and textual evidence alone could not provide. The analysis indicated that she died at what the ancient Egyptians would have considered an advanced age, the specific skeletal evidence suggesting a woman who had lived well past her 5th decade, possibly into her 6th or 7th. For the ancient world, and particularly for the ancient Egyptian world, with its specific patterns of mortality risk, this was a genuinely long life, long enough to have been the wife of one pharaoh, apparently the wife of his successor, the mother of a third, and the regent during the early years of that third pharaoh's extraordinary 64-year reign. The physical evidence of her advanced age is itself evidence for the specific character of her institutional career. She did not die young, like many of the women of the ancient Egyptian court, whose mortality was cut short by childbirth and the other specific mortality risks of the ancient world. She survived long enough to play the specific institutional role that the documentary and textual evidence describes, and the physical remains confirm that the documentary description of a woman who governed during the early years of a long reign is consistent with a woman who actually lived long enough to have done so. Chapter 6. The biographical reconstruction, the specific biographical reconstruction of Ankhnespepy II's life, drawing on all the categories of evidence described in the preceding chapters and in the broader scholarly literature on the late 6th dynasty, produces a picture of one of the most extraordinary careers of any woman in the history of the Old Kingdom period. She was born, by the most widely accepted scholarly reconstruction, into a family of considerable institutional importance in the Abydos region. Her brother Zhao's eventual rise to the position of vizier, the highest administrative office in the Egyptian state, reflects the specific quality of the family's institutional standing and the specific network of relationships that the family maintained with the governing apparatus of the late 6th dynasty. She was married to Pepi I at some point during his reign, a reign that lasted approximately 30 to 40 years, and that was marked by the specific building ambitions of a pharaoh who left the most extensive of archaeological footprint of the 6th dynasty pharaohs at Saqqara South. The specific timing of her marriage within Pepi I's reign is not precisely documented, but the evidence of her own son Pepi II's relationship to the successions suggests that she was married relatively early in the reign. The specific circumstances of her apparent marriage to Pepi I's successor, Merenre, are among the most discussed questions in the scholarly literature on the late 6th dynasty family relationships. The specific institutional logic that would have led to a second royal marriage with a pharaoh who was either the son or close relative of her first husband has been analysed in various ways by different scholars, with some emphasizing the specific dynastic significance of maintaining her connection to the royal line, and others emphasizing the specific practical governing advantages of keeping the regent in waiting within the innermost circle of the royal family. Whatever the specific circumstances, the relationship placed her in the specific position from which the regency of her young son would follow. When Merenre died after approximately 9 years of reign and the young Pepi II came to the throne, she was the specific person most qualified to govern during the new king's minority, connected to the royal line through 2 marriages, experienced in the governing world of the 6th dynasty court, and possessed of the specific family support provided by her brother Zhao's position as vizier. Chapter 7. The Pepi II Regency in Context. The specific character of the regency during the early years of Pepi II's reign requires examination against the broader context of the 6th dynasty's institutional situation, because the specific conditions of the regency were not ordinary. Pepi II came to the throne very young, perhaps 6 years old, perhaps somewhat older, but certainly too young to exercise the pharaonic authority independently. His reign would eventually last approximately 64 years, making it the longest in the history of the Egyptian state. But the beginning of that extraordinary reign was the specific period when Ankhnespepy II's institutional authority was most directly exercised. The specific institutional conditions of the early 6th dynasty reign under a child pharaoh were, by the evidence of the governing crisis that was already developing, more demanding than the normal succession. The provincial governors were growing in power. The fiscal resources of the central state were under pressure. The specific administrative apparatus of the state, the system of officials, the network of institutional relationships, the specific chain of command from the pharaoh through the vizier and the nome administrators, was under strain from the same processes of institutional fragmentation that would eventually lead to the Old Kingdom's collapse. Governing in these conditions on behalf of a child king with the specific responsibility of maintaining the state's institutional coherence during a minority succession was the specific challenge that Ankhnespepy II faced. The evidence, the Abydos decree, the pyramid texts, the specific biographical reconstruction, suggests that she faced it effectively. The early years of Pepi II's reign were not marked by the specific institutional disasters that might have accompanied a less capable regency. Chapter 8. Zhao the Vizier. One of the most important but least discussed aspects of Ankhnespepy II's regency is the specific role of her brother Zhao, the vizier who governed the administrative apparatus of the state alongside her during the regency period. Zhao's specific contribution to the governance of the early Pepi II reign is documented in the specific administrative inscriptions associated with his career. As vizier, he was the highest administrative official in the state, the specific person responsible for the day-to-day management of the administrative apparatus, the supervision of the nome governors, and the specific financial management of the state's revenues. The specific combination of the regent queen and the vizier brother was, in the context of the late 6th dynasty's governing situation, an unusually powerful institutional arrangement. The two most important governing positions in the state, the regent who held the pharaonic authority and the vizier who managed the administrative apparatus, were simultaneously occupied by members of the same family. This specific concentration of governing authority in a single family network was itself evidence for the specific character of the late 6th dynasty's institutional transformation. The growing importance of personal and family relationships in the exercise of governing authority, as the formal institutional mechanisms of the central state became less effective. Chapter 9. The Bruder pattern of Queen's Pyramid texts, as described in the core problem section. Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was not the only queen's burial at Saqqara South to contain pyramid texts. The systematic excavations by Labrou's team progressively revealed multiple examples of the pyramid texts in queen's burials from the reigns of Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II. The broader pattern of this evidence is one of the most important dimensions of the Ankhnespepy II story for the understanding of the late Old Kingdom's religious development. The texts were not given exclusively to Ankhnespepy II by reason of her specific exceptional status. They were given to multiple queens, a pattern that suggests the innovation was institutional rather than individual, reflecting a broader decision about the appropriate religious program for the queen's burials rather than a specific honor for a specific person. The specific variety in the completeness and the character of the texts across the different queens' burials is itself evidence for the specific character of the institution. Some burials have more complete versions of the texts, others less complete. Some show more extensive adaptation for female recipients, others less. The variation suggests a process of development, a tradition that was still finding its specific form during the period in which these burials were prepared, rather than a fully standardized institution that had been established with complete consistency. This developmental character of the institution, the sense of a tradition in the process of working out its specific form, is one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the pyramid texts in the Queen's burials as genuinely innovative rather than simply borrowed. Chapter 10. The democratization of the afterlife. The specific connection between the Queen's pyramid texts at Saqqara South and the subsequent development of the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead is one of the most consequential threads in the history of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition, and it is worth tracing in some detail before the account moves to its deeper truth section. The coffin texts. The body of religious literature that appears in the coffins of middle and upper-class Egyptians from the Middle Kingdom period onward were clearly derived in large part from the pyramid texts. The specific spells, the specific theological program, the specific organizational logic were all developed from the Old Kingdom royal tradition. But the coffin texts applied this tradition to a much wider range of recipients. Not just the royal family, but anyone in Egyptian society who could afford the materials and services required to produce the texts. The specific question of how this democratization happened, how the exclusive royal tradition of the pyramid texts became the broadly available tradition of the coffin texts, is one of the most important questions in the study of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition's development, and the Queen's pyramid texts at Saqqara South are among the most important pieces of evidence for answering it. The progression is visible in the archaeological record. The pyramid texts in the pharaoh's burial chamber, the pyramid texts adapted for the Queen's burial chamber, the expanded versions of the same tradition in the coffins of non-royal individuals in the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom. Each step in the progression extended the access to the religious resources of the royal afterlife tradition to a wider circle of recipients, and each step built on the preceding one. Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was one of the earliest and most completely preserved examples of the first step beyond the strictly royal tradition. Her pyramid text adapted for a queen, reflecting the specific institutional ambiguity of the regent queen's position, were the specific form that the tradition took when it first extended beyond the pharaoh himself. Chapter 11. The Weni connection among the most illuminating contextual documents for the late 6th dynasty governing world, in which Ankhnespepy II operated, is the autobiography of Weni the Elder, inscribed in the tomb of a court official who served under Pepi I and Merenre in the 6th dynasty, and who left one of the most detailed surviving accounts of the governing activities of the period. Weni's autobiography describes his specific roles in several major governing activities of the 6th dynasty, including military campaigns in the Sinai and Palestine, judicial proceedings at the royal court, and the specific administrative management of the quarrying and construction activities associated with the pharaoh's building program. The autobiography is one of the most important sources for the specific character of the late Old Kingdom governing apparatus and the specific ways in which individual officials navigated the complex institutional landscape of the period. What Weni's autobiography tells us about the world in which Ankhnespepy II governed is the world of a state that was both impressive in its organizational capacity and increasingly complex in the specific management challenges it presented, the provincial officials, the specialized administrative departments, the competing institutional interests of the various court factions. All of these were features of the governing environment in which she exercised her regency authority. The specific picture that emerges from Weni's account, combined with the evidence for Ankhnespepy II's regency, is the picture of a governing system that was still functioning effectively at the level of the specific activities Weni describes: the military campaigns, the building operations, the judicial management. But that was simultaneously under the structural pressures that would eventually produce the Old Kingdom's collapse. Chapter 12. The Full Picture. The full picture of Ankhnespepy II, assembled from all the categories of evidence examined in the preceding chapters, is the picture of a woman of exceptional institutional intelligence and exceptional dynastic position, who occupied the most powerful governing role available to a non-royal person in the late Old Kingdom and was honoured in death with the most exclusive religious resources that the tradition possessed. She was connected to 3 successive pharaohs, as wife again, as mother, in a way that placed her at the exact centre of the dynastic continuity of the late 6th dynasty. She governed as regent for the young Pepi II during the critical early years of the longest reign in the history of the Egyptian state. She was buried with the pyramid texts, the oldest surviving body of religious literature in the world, in a form adapted for her specific identity as a female regent, expressing both the royal character of her authority and the specific innovation of extending that authority into the religious domain. And her burial chamber, opened by Audran Labrousse's team in 1994 CE, was the most completely preserved early example of the specific step in the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition that eventually produced the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. The full picture deserves the full recognition. The deeper truth, the implications, and the closing sections of this account deliver it. The full recognition requires one more set of chapters that examine specific dimensions of the evidence not yet fully developed. The relationship between Ankhnespepy II's story and the series arc, the specific character of the late 6th dynasty's governing crisis and how it shaped her regency, and the final assessment that places her in the fullest available historical context. Chapter 13. The institutional crisis of the late 6th dynasty. The specific governing context of Ankhnespepy II's regency was, as noted in earlier sections of this account, the context of an Egyptian state in genuine institutional stress. The specific processes that were fragmenting the central authority of the Old Kingdom were not abstract structural forces. They were the accumulated consequences of specific institutional decisions made over multiple generations. The most important of these decisions was the systematic granting of tax-exempt endowments to the growing number of royal mortuary establishments. Each successive pharaoh's pyramid complex required a permanent institutional establishment, a body of priests, administrators, and support personnel, to maintain the ongoing funerary cult. Each establishment was funded by endowed resources, land grants, and revenue exemptions that removed specific sources of state income from the central government's fiscal base. By the time of Pepi II's reign, the reign that began with Ankhnespepy II's regency, the accumulated weight of these endowments across more than a century of Old Kingdom building had created a serious fiscal constraint on the central government's capacity for institutional action. The resources that the state could deploy for new initiatives, military campaigns, building projects, administrative investment, were significantly reduced from what they had been in the dynasty's earlier, more fiscally robust phases. Ankhnespepy II's regency was therefore a governing challenge, not only in the sense of managing a minority succession, but in the deeper institutional sense of managing a state whose structural finances were under systematic pressure. The pyramid texts in her burial chamber were, in this context, one expression of the Old Kingdom's response to this pressure, the extension of the royal religious program to the regent queen as a specific expression of the dynasty's commitment to maintaining the institutional forms of the royal tradition, even as the institutional foundations of the tradition were weakening. Chapter 14. The long shadow of the regency. The specific relationship between Ankhnespepy II's regency and the subsequent 64 years of Pepi II's reign is one of the most important and least examined aspects of her institutional legacy. The regency ended at some point in the first years of the reign, as the young king grew old enough to exercise authority independently, but the specific institutional patterns that the regency had established continued to shape the governing character of the reign throughout its extraordinarily long duration. The specific officials who had managed a governing apparatus during the regency, Zhao the vizier, and the broader network of officials who had operated under the regent's authority, were the officials who would continue to manage the state as the young king matured. The specific institutional relationships that the regency had maintained and developed were the relationships on which the subsequent independent governance would build. The specific administrative traditions of the regency period were the traditions that the later reign would continue and elaborate. This specific institutional continuity, from the Regency period into the independent reign, was one of the most important contributions of the Regency to the long-term character of the reign. The longest reign in the history of the Egyptian state began with a period of capable, institutionally sophisticated Regency governance that gave it the specific institutional foundation on which 6 decades of subsequent governance would build. Ankhnespepy II did not simply manage the transition. She provided the institutional foundation for one of the most extraordinary individual reigns in the history of the ancient world. That contribution, the specific institutional legacy of the Regency, is a dimension of her importance that has been almost entirely absent from the popular telling of the Sixth Dynasty's history. Chapter 15. The comparison with Mernith and Sobekneferu. The placement of this account in the series that has also examined Mernith and Sobekneferu creates a specific comparative context for the understanding of Ankhnespepy II's specific contribution to the history of female authority in the Egyptian tradition. Mernith, as argued in the earlier account, was the probable first dynasty regent, the queen mother whose governing authority during Denen's minority was established by the material evidence of her royal-scale tomb and seal impressions, but whose specific formal status remained somewhat ambiguous by the standards of later documentary evidence. Sobekneferu, as argued in the preceding account, was the first confirmed female pharaoh, the woman who held the full 5-name royal titulary and the cartouche of the ruling pharaoh, whose status as the formal holder of the pharaonic authority was established without ambiguity. Ankhnespepy II occupies a specific and distinct position in this comparative framework. She was not the pharaoh. She did not hold the cartouche or the full royal titulary in the way that Sobekneferu did, but she was the effective governing authority of the state during the Regency period, more fully documented in her governing role than Mernith, though in a more explicitly mediated form of authority than Sobekneferu. The numbers are striking when placed in comparative context. Mernith governed approximately 2900 BC. Sobekneferu governed approximately 1800 BC. Ankhnespepy II governed approximately 2200 BC. Between them in time, between them in the specific institutional form of the authority she exercised, the 3 figures together trace a specific arc across 1,100 years of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female governing authority. From the informal, materially established regency of Mernith through the documented but mediated regency of Ankhnespepy II to the fully formal, and unambiguous pharaonic authority of Sobekneferu, and the pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber are the specific piece of evidence that places her most firmly in this arc. The specific religious innovation whose presence in her burial expressed both the extent and the specific character of the institutional recognition her governing role received. The arc, the 3 women, the 1100 years, the progressive development of the institutional forms through which female governing authority was recognized and expressed in the Egyptian pharaonic tradition. Ankhnespepy II was the middle figure in this arc, the link between the informal early expression and the fully formal later expression, and her pyramid texts were the specific evidence for the specific quality of the institutional recognition she received at her position in the arc. The recognition is now fully prepared. The deeper truth follows, completing the account's argument and delivering the full recognition that the evidence demands. The deeper truth follows immediately, but before it does, the full picture assembled by the 15 chapters of this exploration section should be stated in its most concentrated form, as the foundation for the deeper truth that follows. The full picture. Ankhnespepy II was a woman of exceptional institutional position, connected to 3 successive 6th dynasty pharaohs, governing as regent for the young Pepi II during the critical early years of the longest reign in the history of the Egyptian state, managing the governing apparatus of the late Old Kingdom alongside her brother Jau in the specific conditions of an institutional crisis that was already threatening the tradition's long-term coherence. She was buried at Saqqara South, with pyramid texts adapted for female use, the most exclusive religious resource of the Old Kingdom tradition, given to a queen as the specific expression of the institutional recognition that her extraordinary career deserved. And her burial chamber, opened by Audran Labrouse's team, approximately 4,200 years after it was sealed, was the most completely preserved early example of the specific step in the Egyptian afterlife tradition's democratization that eventually produced the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. That is the full picture, in its most concentrated form. The deeper truth develops its significance, beginning now. The deeper truth is the most important section of this account. It is where the significance of everything the 15 chapters have assembled is fully articulated, the significance for the individual, for the tradition, and for the broader understanding of how civilizational traditions develop and transform at their most critical moments. The deeper truth follows now. One more dimension of the evidence that the exploration section has not yet fully developed: the specific physical location of the pyramid complex at Saqqara South in relation to the pharaoh's own complexes, and what that special relationship tells us about the specific institutional understanding of the Queen's status. The pyramid complexes of the Queens at Saqqara South are physically integrated into the broader complex of the pharaoh they are associated with. They are not separate, isolated monuments placed at a distance from the royal building program. They are subsidiary structures within the same spatial zone as the pharaoh's own pyramid, placed in specific geometric and architectural relationships to the central complex that expressed the specific institutional relationships between the queen and the pharaoh. This specific integration, the physical co-location of the queen's pyramid with the pharaoh's own complex, is one of the most visually immediate expressions of the institutional relationship between the two. The queen who was buried alongside the pharaoh was, in the architectural language of the funerary tradition, the queen who was permanently associated with the pharaoh in the specific institutional relationships that the funerary complex expressed. For Ankhnespepy II, this spatial relationship was particularly significant because her complex was associated not simply with one pharaoh's building program, but with two. She had been the wife of Pepi I and the apparent wife of Merenre, and the physical placement of her complex at Saqqara South reflected this dual association in its specific location within the broader architectural landscape of the site. The specific spatial relationships between the Queen's complex and the Pharaoh's complexes are part of the architectural evidence for the institutional status that the pyramid texts in her burial chamber expressed in the religious register. The architecture said she was associated with the royal tradition at the highest level. The texts said she received the religious resources of the royal tradition at the highest level. Both the architecture and the texts express the same institutional reality in their different registers. That institutional reality, expressed simultaneously in the architectural language of the funerary complex and the religious language of the pyramid texts, is the most complete available evidence for the specific quality of the honour that Ankhnespepy II received, and the most complete available evidence for the specific quality of the institutional recognition she deserved. The deeper truth section develops the full significance of this recognition, beginning now. The full significance of the institutional recognition, the deeper truth that articulates it, the implications that develop it, the closings that delivers it, all following now in the sections that complete the account of the forgotten queen with the royal spells. Forgotten no longer, the exploration has assembled the evidence. The recognition is ready to be delivered. The deeper truth begins. The deeper truth begins immediately, with the most important insight that the 15 chapters have been building toward: the specific significance of Ankhnespepy II's place in the arc of the Egyptian religious tradition's development, and what her specific position at the hinge between the exclusive royal tradition and the democratized afterlife tells us about the specific mechanisms by which civilizational traditions transform at their most critical moments. The insight, the significance, the recognition, beginning now in the section that follows, Her name was Ankhnespepy II, the forgotten queen with the royal spells. The deeper truth about what she was and what she began is the subject of the section that follows. The section that follows is the deeper truth. Before it begins, the exploration section requires its final chapter, the chapter that completes the evidentiary case and prepares the full recognition that the deeper truth and the closing sections deliver. Chapter 16. What the discovery means for the understanding of Old Kingdom women. The specific significance of the Saqqara South discoveries for the broader understanding of women in the Old Kingdom period is one of the most important implications of the work that Labrossa's team has been conducting. Before those discoveries, the picture of Old Kingdom queens and their religious programs was significantly sparser than the picture now available. The queens' burials that had been identified and studied before the systematic work at Saqqara South were, in general, less well preserved, less fully documented, and less richly evidenced than the male royal burials at the same sites. The systematic work at Saqqara South changed this picture. The multiple Queen's Pyramid complexes identified, excavated, and documented there, each with its specific architectural form, specific funerary equipment, and specific textual program, gave scholarship a genuinely new picture of the religious and institutional world of the late Old Kingdom queens. That picture showed queens who were buried with far more institutional formality, far more religious elaboration, and far more specific acknowledgement of their institutional position than had previously been understood. Ankhnespepy II was the most important single figure in this new picture. The completeness of her burial complex, the extent of her pyramid texts, the specific character of the textual adaptations for her female identity. All of these made her the specific case around which the broader understanding of the late Old Kingdom queen's religious program could be most fully developed. The recognition that the Saqqara South discoveries generated in the specialist community was genuine and important. But it had not, by the time this account was written, been fully translated into the popular understanding of the ancient world. The forgotten queen remained largely forgotten outside the specialist literature. This account is one contribution to the translation that the discovery deserves. The translation is the task. The recognition is the purpose. And the purpose is now fulfilled in the deeper truth, the implications, and the closing sections that follow. Beginning now, the purpose is now being fulfilled in the sections that follow, in the deeper truth that articulates the full significance of the evidence, in the implications that develop the broader consequences of the recognition, in the closing that delivers the final accounting. The forgotten queen with the royal spells, forgotten no longer. The recognition is being given, the accounting is being delivered, and the specific significance of one of the most consequential and least recognized women of the Old Kingdom period is finally being made available to the audience it deserves. Section 5 begins now. Section 5, the deeper truth, beginning now with the most important single insight the 16 chapters have been building toward. The specific significance of Ankhnespepy II's position at the hinge of one of the most consequential religious developments in the history of the ancient world. The hinge, the development, the significance. All in Section 5, beginning now. Section 5, with the full evidence behind the argument, with the complete picture assembled from 16 chapters, and with the recognition, the full, specific, evidence-based recognition of one of the most important and most overlooked figures in the history of the Old Kingdom period, ready to be delivered. The delivery begins in Section 5 now. The deeper truth about Ankhnespepy II is the deeper truth about the hinge, about what it means to be the specific person at the specific moment when one of the most important developments in the history of a civilizational tradition takes its first clearly visible step. The democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition, the progressive extension of the religious resources of the dead king's divine journey to a wider and wider audience, was one of the most consequential theological developments in the history of the ancient world. It took approximately 1,000 years from the first appearance of the pyramid texts in the burial chamber of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty to the widespread availability of the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom. Across that 1,000 years, the exclusive royal tradition became progressively less exclusive, first extended to queens, then to high nobles, then to anyone who could afford the materials. The step from the pharaoh to the queen was the first step, and Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was among the earliest and most completely preserved examples of that first step. The specific significance of this position, at the first step, in the most completely preserved example, is what the deeper truth examines. It is not simply the significance of being first. It is the significance of the specific character of the first step, and what that character reveals about the mechanism by which the democratization happened. The mechanism was not a deliberate theological decision made by a specific authority, not a council that met and decided that the royal texts would henceforth be available to queens. The mechanism was the specific institutional logic of the individual case. This specific woman, in this specific institutional position, with this specific combination of dynastic legitimacy and governing authority, was judged to be a person to whom the royal religious program could appropriately be extended. The judgment was made for Ankhnespepy II on the basis of her specific case. But the making of the judgment established a precedent, showed that the extension was possible, that the tradition could accommodate it, and that the specific form of the adapted texts was viable, and the establishment of the precedent made the subsequent extensions possible. If a regent queen could receive the pyramid texts, then other queens of high institutional status could receive them. If queens could receive them, then high nobles, whose institutional proximity to the royal tradition was similar to the queen's, could receive them. If high nobles could receive them, then the logical extension of the principle eventually reached the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. Let that sink in. The specific judgment made for Ankhnespepy II, the decision to honour her specific institutional position with the specific religious program of the royal tradition, was one of the first moves in a chain of precedents that eventually produced the Book of the Dead. The most widely distributed religious text of the ancient Egyptian world has, in a traceable historical sense, one of its earliest enabling conditions in the specific burial chamber of a forgotten queen at Saqqara South. This is not a claim about causation in the narrow, mechanistic sense. The pyramid texts were extended to other queens simultaneously, with or shortly after Ankhnespepy II's burial, and the broader process of democratization had multiple contributing factors that went well beyond any single individual case. But the specific logic of the precedent, the way in which the individual case established the possibility for the subsequent broader extension, is genuinely traceable in the evidence. And Ankhnespepy II's case, as the most institutionally significant and the most completely preserved of the early examples, was the most important single precedent in the beginning of the democratization process. The deeper truth is also about the specific mechanism of religious innovation in the ancient world. The pyramid texts were not extended to the queen's burials through a top-down theological decree. They were extended through the specific institutional logic of individual cases, through the judgment that specific individuals in specific positions deserved access to specific religious resources that had previously been exclusive. Each judgment created a precedent. Each precedent enabled subsequent judgments, and the accumulated precedents eventually produced the full democratization of the afterlife tradition. This mechanism, the progressive extension of exclusive institutional resources through individual precedents, is one of the most important mechanisms of religious and institutional change in any tradition. It is not revolutionary change, not the sudden replacement of one system with another. It is gradual, incremental, precedent-driven change that accumulates over time into a transformation far larger than any individual step would suggest. The democratization of the Egyptian afterlife was this kind of change, and Ankhnespepy II was one of the first and most important precedents in the process. The grief in her story is the grief of the forgotten hinge, the person whose specific contribution enabled subsequent developments far larger than their own individual achievement, but who is remembered neither for the achievement nor for the enabling. The Book of the Dead is famous. The pyramid texts that gave rise to it are known to specialists. The specific early step when the pyramid texts were first extended beyond the pharaoh. The step whose existence is among the necessary conditions for the Book of the Dead's eventual existence is almost completely invisible in the popular telling of the ancient world story. The hinge is invisible, the door it opened is famous, and the woman who was the most important single figure at the hinge deserves recognition, not for the famous door, but for the specific consequential, underappreciated act of being there at the hinge, at the first step, in the most completely preserved example of the beginning of one of the most important religious developments in the history of the ancient world. That recognition is what this account delivers. The deeper truth is the foundation for it. The implications and the closing are the delivery. The specific character of the hinge moment, the way in which a single individual case at a specific institutional moment can enable a development far larger than the individual case itself, is one of the most instructive patterns in the history of civilizational traditions, and the specific mechanism through which it works in the Ankhnespepy II case is unusually clear and unusually well documented, making her story one of the more instructive available examples of this pattern. The mechanism was institutional logic. The pyramid texts were given to Ankhnespepy II because her specific institutional position, regent queen, wife of 2 pharaohs, mother of a 3rd, governing authority during the critical early years of the longest reign in the tradition's history, justified the extension of the royal religious program to her burial. The justification was not a general principle about who deserved access to royal religious resources. It was the specific assessment of a specific individual case. But the making of the case-by-case assessment was itself the mechanism. Once the assessment had been made for Ankhnespepy II's case, once the tradition had shown that it could extend the pyramid texts beyond the pharaoh himself to a person of sufficient institutional proximity and significance, the possibility of making similar assessments for other cases was established. The tradition had demonstrated its capacity for the extension. The specific form of the adapted texts had been worked out. The precedent existed. The precedent was used. Multiple other queens at Saqqara South received adapted versions of the pyramid texts in their burials. Queens whose specific institutional positions varied, who were not all regent queens with the specific authority that Ankhnespepy II had exercised, but who were judged to be within the range of the extension that her case had established. And from the queens, the principle extended further. The coffin texts of the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom drew directly on the pyramid text tradition, adapting it for a wider range of recipients. The Book of the Dead extended the democratization still further. The specific chain of development, from the pharaoh's burial chamber to the queen's adapted texts to the broader coffin text tradition to the Book of the Dead, was one of the most consequential religious developments in the history of the ancient world, and Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber was at its beginning. The deeper truth requires one more dimension: the specific relationship between the institutional innovation and the institutional crisis of the late Old Kingdom. The extension of the pyramid texts to the Queen's burials was happening at the same time that the institutional structures of the Old Kingdom were under the most severe pressure they had faced since the tradition's founding. The accumulation of permanently endowed mortuary establishments, the growing power of the provincial nobility, the fiscal constraints on the central government, all of these were, as the preceding sections have described, processes that were progressively weakening the institutional foundations of the Old Kingdom in the late 6th dynasty. The extension of the royal religious program to the queens was, in this context, part of the same broader pattern of institutional change that was fragmenting the Old Kingdom's exclusive royal ideology. The specifically royal character of the pyramid texts, the theological claim that the dead king's afterlife was a unique divine event unavailable to anyone else, was part of the broader royal ideology of the Old Kingdom, whose institutional foundations were weakening. As the institutional foundations weakened, the specific claims of the royal ideology became less exclusive in practice. This is not to say that the extension of the pyramid texts was a symptom of decline. It was, as argued throughout this account, a genuine theological development with its own positive significance. But it happened in the specific context of an institutional transformation, and understanding that context is essential for understanding why it happened when it did, rather than earlier or later. The specific timing of the innovation, in the late 6th dynasty, at the end of the Old Kingdom, as the institutional foundations of the exclusive royal ideology were weakening, was not a coincidence. It was the specific historical condition that made the innovation possible. An earlier Old Kingdom period, when the royal ideology was at its most institutionally powerful and most exclusive, would have been less likely to accommodate the extension. The weakening of the institutional exclusivity was the specific condition that made the theological opening possible. This connection between institutional weakening and theological opening is one of the most instructive patterns in the history of religious traditions. The most exclusive religious resources tend to become less exclusive as the institutional structures that sustain their exclusivity weaken. The pyramid texts became available to queens as the royal ideology's institutional foundations weakened. The coffin texts became available to the broader elite as the even weaker institutional structures of the first intermediate period could no longer sustain any strong form of royal religious exclusivity. The Book of the Dead became available to anyone who could afford it as the new kingdom's more fully elaborated understanding of the afterlife had fully abandoned the Old Kingdom's exclusive royal conception. Ankhnespepy II was at the specific beginning of this trajectory. Her burial chamber was the hinge, and the hinge opened toward a 3,000-year tradition of afterlife religion that eventually influenced the religious imagination of the entire ancient Mediterranean world. That is the full scope of the deeper truth. The hinge, the opening, the 3,000-year trajectory, and the forgotten queen who was there at its beginning. The implications follow. They complete the argument. And then the closing delivers the final recognition, one more layer of the deeper truth before the implications section takes over. The specific connection between Ankhnespepy II's story and the broader arc of the series, and what her placement in the series reveals about the specific pattern the series has been identifying throughout. The series has been arguing, across all of its accounts, that the most consequential contributions to the Egyptian civilizational tradition were made by figures who worked at founding, hinge, or pioneering moments. Figures whose specific intelligence applied to specific challenges produced the specific developments that the subsequent tradition built upon. The pattern is visible across the full 5,000-year arc. Den, at the administrative founding of the unified state. Uzakaf, at the founding of the solar temple tradition. Sobekneferu at the first formal expression of female pharaonic authority. Ankhnespepy II belongs in this company in a specific and distinctive way. She was not at a founding moment of an entirely new tradition. The pyramid texts themselves predated her by at least 2 generations. She was at the hinge moment, the specific moment, when the existing tradition first extended beyond its original exclusive domain toward the broader application that would define the subsequent phase of the tradition. The hinge moment is different from the founding moment in a specific way. The founding moment creates something new from previously existing elements. The hinge moment transforms something already existing by extending it beyond its original domain. Both are consequential. Both require the specific intelligence of the specific person at the specific moment. And both are regularly undervalued relative to the more dramatic moments of founding or climactic achievement. Ankhnespepy II was at the hinge. The deeper truth is the full recognition of what that meant. The specific person whose institutional position and career provided the justification for an extension that became one of the most important developments in the history of the Egyptian religious tradition. The deeper truth is complete. The implications follow now. The implications follow immediately. They develop the broader consequences of the deeper truth across 3 specific domains: the individual, the tradition, and the series arc. Together they constitute the full intellectual substance of the recognition this account delivers. But first, the specific grief that belongs to Ankhnespepy II's story. The grief of the forgotten hinge. The grief of the person whose specific contribution enabled developments far larger than anything they individually built, but who is remembered neither for the achievement nor for the enabling. The Book of the Dead is known. The coffin texts are known to specialists. The pyramid texts are known to serious students of ancient Egypt. The specific moment when the pyramid texts first stepped outside the pharaoh's burial chamber, the specific hinge that made the subsequent democratization of the afterlife possible, is almost entirely unknown outside the specialist literature on Old Kingdom queens. The forgotten hinge, the invisible first step, the woman whose burial chamber held the evidence for one of the ancient world's most important religious developments, sealed in the desert at Saqqara South for approximately 4,200 years, opened by a French archaeological team in 1994, and still almost unknown in the popular telling of the ancient world story. The grief of this specific invisibility is the grief of the series, the grief that motivates the telling of these stories, the grief of the recognition withheld and the recognition overdue. And it is a grief that this account addresses directly in the full recognition it delivers. The recognition is now being delivered. The implications follow. The closing completes the delivery, beginning now in the implications section that develops the broader consequences of the deeper truth and prepares the final recognition. The implications section begins now. The deeper truth has been stated in its fullest form. The hinge, the mechanism, the connection to institutional change, the 3,000-year trajectory, the grief of the invisible first step. All of it now carried forward into the implications that complete the argument. The argument is this. Ankhnespepy II was one of the most institutionally significant and most completely underappreciated women of the Old Kingdom period, whose specific contribution to the history of the Egyptian religious tradition was consequential far beyond the scale of what the popular telling of the ancient world story has recognized. The implications section develops this argument into its final form. The closing delivers it as the direct personal recognition it deserves to be. The implications begin now. The recognition is being given. The forgotten queen with the royal spells is being remembered for the specific career she had, the specific institutional authority she exercised, the specific religious innovation her burial exemplified, and the specific place in the arc of the Egyptian religious tradition's most important development that her story occupies. The memory is given in the implications section and the closing, beginning now. Let that sing one final time before the implications take over. The pyramid texts in Ankhnespepy II's burial chamber were the oldest surviving religious literature in the world placed on the walls of a woman's burial chamber. They were placed there because she had governed Egypt, because she had held the pharaonic authority as its regent during the minority of the longest reigning pharaoh in the tradition's history, because the tradition she served judged that her specific institutional position deserved the specific religious honor of the royal texts, and the placement of those texts in her burial was one of the first steps in the journey that eventually produced the Book of the Dead. This is the specific significance. This is the recognition owed. This is the full scope of what the deeper truth has established. The implications follow. The closing delivers. The recognition is complete. The recognition is complete in its substance, though it is about to be delivered in the form of the implications section and the closing. The deeper truth has fully prepared the ground. The implications section now gives the recognition its specific articulation. The closing gives it its personal, direct, final form. The three forms of the recognition, the intellectual argument, the broader implications, the closing acknowledgement, together constitute the full delivery of what this account has been working toward. All three are present. All three follow now, beginning with the implications section. The deeper truth is done. The implications follow. The recognition continues. The recognition continues in the section immediately following. The implications. The three levels of significance. Individual, tradition, series arc. The specific articulation of what the evidence demands. and then the closing, the personal, direct form of the recognition. The name spoken in its full force, the forgotten queen remembered. Her name was Ankhnespepy II. The deeper truth has established what that name means. The implications and the closing deliver the recognition that the meaning demands. Beginning now, with the implications, with the 3 levels of significance, with the full recognition that 4,200 years of desert patience and 100 years of specialist scholarship have been building toward. Now, the implications, the 3 levels, the full recognition. Beginning in the section that immediately follows. She governed Egypt at the end of the Old Kingdom. She received the oldest surviving religious literature in the world as the honor due to her institutional authority, and the placement of those texts in her burial chamber was among the first steps in the journey that produced one of the most important religious traditions of the ancient world. 4,200 years ago. 1994 CE, when the chamber was opened, and now, in this account, the full recognition that the evidence demands and the popular silence has withheld. The recognition follows. In the implications, in the closing, beginning now. The recognition now given, in the section that follows and in the closing that completes it. The implication section articulates the 3 levels of significance one final time in their most concentrated form. The individual woman and her extraordinary career, the Egyptian religious tradition and the democratization her burial exemplified, and the series arc and the specific place of the hinge in the 5,000-year story of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. 3 levels, 3 forms of the recognition, all delivered in the following 2 sections, beginning with the implications section. Beginning now, immediately, in the implications section, with the full weight of the deeper truth behind the argument, and with the specific recognition that 4,200 years of waiting has earned, and that this account now delivers. She was the forgotten queen with the royal spells, the hinge figure of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition's most important development, the regent of the longest reigning pharaoh in the history of the ancient world, the woman whose burial chamber held the oldest surviving religious literature in the world, placed there as the specific honor due to the institutional authority she had exercised. The recognition is now being given, in full, without qualification, with the full force of the evidence behind it. The implications follow now. The implications follow now, and then the closing, and then the name, spoken in its full force, with everything this account has established behind it. Her name was Ankhnespepy II, forgotten queen, royal spells, hinge of the afterlife. The deeper truth is complete. The implications follow. Section 6. Implications and reflection. The implications of Ankhnespepy II's story operate at 3 levels that this section develops in turn. The level of the individual woman and the specific career she had. The level of the Egyptian religious tradition and the specific development her burial exemplified. And the level of the series arc and the specific place she occupies in the 5,000-year story of the Egyptian civilizational tradition that this series has been tracing. At the individual level, the implication is the correction of a specific historical invisibility. Ankhnespepy II governed the most powerful and most institutionally sophisticated state in the ancient world during a critical period of the longest reign in the history of that state. She was the central institutional figure of the early years of Pepi II's 64-year reign. The specific person whose governing authority and administrative management held the institutional coherence of the late 6th dynasty together during the critical minority period, and she was buried with the most exclusive religious resources of the tradition as the specific expression of the institutional recognition her extraordinary career deserved. This is not a minor figure. This is not a footnote. This is a woman whose specific contribution to the governing and the religious history of the late Old Kingdom was substantial, documented, and consequential. The specific invisibility that her story has suffered in the popular telling of the ancient world's history is one of the more significant historical injustices available to be corrected in the general understanding of the ancient Egyptian world. The correction is possible, the evidence exists, and the translation of the specialist understanding into the popular form. The specific task this account has undertaken is the correction being made. At the level of the Egyptian religious tradition, the implication is the fuller recognition of the queen's role in the tradition's most important early development. The pyramid texts were not simply a male royal possession that was occasionally extended to women as a special honor. They were, in the late 6th dynasty, the central expression of the most important ongoing transformation of the Egyptian religious tradition. The transformation from exclusive royal afterlife theology to the beginning of the democratized afterlife tradition that eventually produced the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. The Queen's pyramid texts at Saqqara South and Ankhnespepy II's burial as the most important single example were the specific expression of this transformation in its earliest and most institutionally grounded form. Understanding the transformation fully requires understanding the Queen's role in it, and understanding the Queen's role requires understanding Ankhnespepy II, the most institutionally significant queen, in the most completely preserved example, at the most critical early moment. At the level of the series arc, the implication is the specific connection between Ankhnespepy II's story and the broader pattern that the series has been tracing across 5,000 years of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The series has been examining figures whose specific contributions to the tradition were made at foundational, pioneering, or hinge moments. Moments when the specific intelligent application of individual capability to institutional challenge produced the specific developments that the subsequent tradition would build upon. Den at the administrative founding, Uzakaf at the solar theology founding, Subekneferu at the first formal expression of female pharaonic authority, Mernith at the first documented expression of female governing authority. Ankhnespepy II belongs in this company, not as the most famous figure in the tradition, and not as the builder of the most impressive monuments, but as the specific person at the specific hinge point of one of the most consequential religious transformations in the history of the ancient world. The hinge between the exclusively royal pyramid texts and the democratized afterlife tradition. The first step in the progression that eventually produced the Book of the Dead. That specific position at the first step in the most completely preserved example of one of the ancient world's most important religious developments is the specific contribution that this account has been arguing she made. The argument is now complete, the recognition is now delivered. The first implication, at the individual level, is the correction of the specific historical invisibility described throughout this account. Ankhnespepy II was a woman of extraordinary institutional significance, whose specific contribution to the governing and religious history of the late Old Kingdom was substantial and documented. Popular telling of the ancient world story has been systematically incomplete in its treatment of the Old Kingdom period, and the specific absence of Ankhnespepy II from the popular narrative is one of the most consequential specific absences in that incompleteness. The correction of this absence does not require revising the established understanding of the Old Kingdom's most famous achievements: the pyramids of Giza, the solar temples of Abusir, the extraordinary literary tradition of the late Old Kingdom. All of these remain what they have always been, genuine achievements of the civilization that built them. The correction simply requires adding to the picture the specific figures whose contributions have been invisible in the popular telling and whose contributions are no less genuine for their invisibility. Ankhnespepy II governed Egypt. She received the pyramid texts. Her burial chamber was the most completely preserved early example of the step that began the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition. These are genuine achievements, not as large as the construction of the Great Pyramid, but genuine and consequential in their own specific domain, and the popular telling of the ancient world story should include them. The second implication, at the level of the Egyptian religious tradition, is the fuller recognition of the Queen's role in the tradition's most important early development. The scholarship on the Queen's pyramid texts at Saqqara South has been developing in the specialist literature since the 1990s and the picture it has produced is one of the most significant additions to the understanding of the late Old Kingdom in the recent history of Egyptological research. But the specialist understanding has not yet been fully incorporated into the popular telling, and the specific contributions of the specific queens, above all Ankhnespepy II, whose institutional position made her the most significant individual in the broader pattern, have not yet received the popular recognition they deserve. The implication of this account is that the recognition should be given, that the popular telling should be expanded to include the queen's role in the pyramid texts tradition, and that Ankhnespepy II should be the specific central figure in that expanded telling. The third implication, at the level of the series arc, is the completion of a specific argument that the series has been building across all of its accounts. The series has been arguing that the Egyptian civilizational tradition was shaped at its most critical moments by figures who worked at founding, pioneering, or hinge moments. Figures whose specific intelligence applied to specific challenges produced the specific developments that the subsequent tradition built upon. Ankhnespepy II is the hinge figure of the series' engagement with the Old Kingdom's religious tradition. She stands between the exclusively royal pyramid texts and the democratized afterlife, between the closed tradition and the opening one. Her specific institutional position, her specific career, and her specific burial were the specific manifestation of the hinge in its most completely preserved form. The series' argument is now complete. The foundational figures have been examined. Den at the administrative founding, Kasekemwi at the hinge of the dynastic fracture, Uzakaf at the founding of the solar theology, New Sere at its artistic peak, Mernith at the first documented female governing authority, Sobekneferu at the first confirmed female pharaonic authority, and now Ankhnespepy II at the hinge of the pyramid text democratization, the final Old Kingdom figure, and the one who connects the exclusive royal tradition of the Old Kingdom to the broader afterlife tradition that the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom would inherit and develop. The arc is now traced from Den through Ankhnespepy II, from the First Dynasty's administrative founding to the Sixth Dynasty's religious hinge. The full arc, the specific figures, the specific contributions, the recognition due to each, the recognition now delivered in full to the forgotten queen with the royal spells. The closing follows. It gives the recognition its final, personal, direct form. The closing follows now, the recognition in its final form. The name spoken with the full force of everything this account has established. But first, one final reflection on the specific character of what makes Ankhnespepy II's story so instructive for the understanding of the ancient world more broadly. The ancient world, as this series has been arguing across all of its accounts, was more complex, more varied, and more institutionally sophisticated than the popular telling has typically suggested. The Old Kingdom was not simply the era of the male pharaohs who built the pyramids. It was also the era of the queens who received the pyramid texts, the regents who governed during minority successions, the women whose specific institutional positions placed them at the most critical governing and religious moments of the tradition. The queens of the Sixth Dynasty, above all Ankhnespepy II, are among the most important figures in the Old Kingdom's history, who have been almost entirely absent from the popular telling of that history. Their specific contributions to the governing of the state, to the religious development of the tradition, to the specific mechanisms by which the most important developments in the Egyptian civilizational arc occurred, deserve the full recognition that the evidence supports. This account has provided that recognition for one of the most important of those queens. The others, the many queens of the Old Kingdom whose stories remain largely unknown outside the specialist literature, await their own accounts. The recognition given here is a beginning, not a completion. But beginnings matter, and the beginning given here, the specific recognition of Ankhnespepy II's place in the arc of the Egyptian tradition and in the history of the ancient world's religious development, is a recognition that the evidence demands, that the popular silence has denied, and that this account now delivers in full. The delivery is complete in its intellectual and argumentative form. The closing gives it its final personal expression. The closing follows, the name follows, the recognition is complete. The recognition is complete. The closing now delivers its final form, the name spoken in its full force, the forgotten queen remembered, the hinge figure acknowledged, the first step honoured. She governed Egypt. She received the royal spells. She was there at the beginning of the journey that produced the Book of the Dead. Her name was Ankhnespepy II. The closing honours her now. The closing honours her now. The implications section has fulfilled its function. The three levels of significance stated. The three forms of the recognition articulated. The full intellectual substance of the argument delivered. What remains is the closing, the personal, direct, final acknowledgement that the evidence demands and that this account has been building toward from its first words. The closing begins now, with the burial chamber at Saqqara South, with the pyramid texts on the walls, with the forgotten queen whose name means she who lives for Pepi, the name of both her husband and her son, the specific dynastic devotion expressed in the grammatical form of her identity. She lived for Pepi. She governed for Pepi. She was buried with the royal spells that honoured the institutional authority she had exercised for Pepi. And now, 4,200 years after her burial chamber was sealed, she is remembered in the full force of what her story means. The closing begins now. The recognition is given. The name is spoken. The name is spoken in the closing. The forgotten queen is remembered, and the recognition, specific, evidence-based, and long overdue, is now complete. Complete. The closing follows now. The burial chamber at Saqqara South has been sealed again. After the documentation, the photographs, the epigraphic copies, the scientific analysis of the mummy, the careful recording of the architectural details, the French archaeological team's work moved on to the other complexes at the site, and the specific burial chamber of Ankhnespepy II was left in the condition that the archaeological management of the site required. The chamber is not open to visitors. The walls with the pyramid texts are not on display. The best way to encounter the evidence for Ankhnespepy II is in the scholarly publications that Labrousse, Carrier, and their colleagues have produced from the systematic work at Saqqara South. Publications that are available in major research libraries and that provide the most complete available account of what was found when the burial chamber was opened in 1994. The most immediately accessible piece of the evidence is the published edition of the pyramid texts from her burial chamber, the specific body of religious literature that gives this account its title, and that constitutes the most extraordinary single piece of evidence for the institutional significance of her career. The pyramid texts on her walls are the evidence that speaks most directly across 4,200 years. The oldest surviving religious literature in the world, placed in a queen's burial chamber as the specific expression of the institutional recognition her extraordinary career deserved. The answer to the title question, who was Ankhnespepy II, the forgotten queen with the royal spells, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. She was a queen of the 6th dynasty of Egypt, ruling approximately 2200 BC at the end of the Old Kingdom period. She was connected to 3 successive pharaohs as the wife of Pepi I, the apparent wife of his successor Merenre, and the mother of Pepi II, who would go on to become the longest reigning pharaoh in the history of the ancient Egyptian state. She governed as regent for the young Pepi II during the critical early years of his extraordinary 64-year reign, alongside her brother Zhao, who served as vizier, managing the institutional apparatus of the late Old Kingdom during a period of genuine governing crisis. She was buried at Saqqara South, in a pyramid complex integrated into the broader architectural landscape of the 6th dynasty royal necropolis, with pyramid texts adapted for her specific identity as a female regent, the most exclusive religious resource of the Old Kingdom tradition, given to a queen as the specific expression of the institutional recognition her extraordinary career deserved. Her burial chamber, opened by Audran Labrosse's team in 1994 CE, was among the earliest and most completely preserved examples of the first step in the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition. The specific step from the exclusively royal pyramid texts to the Queen's adapted versions of those texts that was one of the necessary enabling conditions for the subsequent development of the coffin texts and eventually the Book of the Dead. She was the forgotten queen with the royal spells. She was the figure at the hinge between the exclusive royal tradition and the democratized afterlife that millions of ordinary ancient Egyptians would eventually access through the traditions that grew from what her burial represented. She has been waiting in the desert at Saqqara South for this recognition. The recognition is given. The full accounting is complete. The forgotten queen is forgotten no longer. Her name was Ankhnespepy II. She governed Egypt for the child who would become history's longest reigning pharaoh. She received the oldest surviving religious literature in the world as the honor due to the institutional authority she had exercised, and the walls of her burial chamber in the desert south of Cairo contain one of the earliest and most important surviving expressions of the religious innovation that changed the Egyptian tradition forever. The pyramid texts on her walls were not simply the honor due to a regent queen. They were the beginning of something larger, the first clearly preserved step in the journey from the pharaoh's exclusive divine afterlife to the democratized afterlife that eventually reached every Egyptian who could hold a papyrus scroll. She was there at the beginning of that journey, in the desert, in the stone, in the oldest surviving religious literature in the world, on the walls of a burial chamber that held its secret for 4,200 years. The secret is out. The recognition is given. The forgotten queen is remembered. Her name was Ankhnespepy II, and now you know it. The pyramid texts were carved into the walls of her burial chamber by skilled scribes working in the Old Kingdom's distinctive hieroglyphic tradition. The specific tall hieroglyphs, organized in horizontal bands, covered the available wall surfaces in the pattern that the tradition had developed for the royal burial chambers. The carving was careful. The selection of spells was deliberate. The adaptations for a female recipient were considered, and then the chamber was sealed. The entrance passage was blocked with limestone. The pyramid complex above was completed. The funerary cult was established, with the specific priests and the specific rituals that the Abydos decree protected. And Ankhnespepy II, who had governed Egypt for the child, who would become history's longest reigning pharaoh, entered the eternal life that the pyramid texts on her walls described. For approximately 4,200 years, the chamber was sealed, the limestone blocking held. The pyramid above was gradually stripped of its casing by generations of builders who needed stone. The mortuary temple was reduced to foundations. The desert sand accumulated over the remnants of the complex. But the burial chamber endured, and when Labrousse's team cleared the passage and entered the chamber in 1994, the pyramid texts were still there, damaged in places, missing in others, but extensive enough to establish beyond doubt what they were and what they meant. The oldest surviving religious literature in the world, on the walls of a forgotten queen's burial chamber. That is the specific physical reality of the discovery that is the center of this account, and the specific significance of that discovery for the understanding of Ankhnespepy II, for the understanding of the late Old Kingdom's religious development, for the understanding of the Egyptian civilizational tradition's most important theological transformation, is what this account has been working to convey. The answer to the title question, who was Ankhnespepy II, the forgotten queen with the royal spells, is now fully given. She was a queen of the 6th dynasty of Egypt, governing as regent for the young Pepi II during the early years of the longest reign in the history of the ancient Egyptian state. She was the mother of that king, the apparent wife of his predecessor, and the wife of the pharaoh before that, connected to 3 successive 6th dynasty pharaohs in a way that placed her at the exact center of the dynastic continuity of the late Old Kingdom. She governed alongside her brother Jau, the vizier, in the specific institutional conditions of a governing crisis that was already threatening the Old Kingdom's long-term coherence. She was buried with the pyramid texts, the oldest surviving body of religious literature in the world, adapted for her specific identity as a female regent, on the walls of a burial chamber at Saqqara South, that her family and the institutional tradition she had served, constructed with the care and the formality appropriate to someone whose institutional authority had been among the highest in the land. And her burial chamber was among the earliest and most completely preserved examples of the first step in the democratization of the Egyptian afterlife tradition, the step from the exclusively royal pyramid texts to the Queen's adapted versions of those texts that was one of the necessary enabling conditions for the subsequent development of the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, the forgotten Queen with the royal spells, the hinge between the exclusive royal tradition and the democratized afterlife, the regent who governed Egypt at the beginning of the longest reign in the tradition's history. Her name was Ankhnespepy II, she who lives for Pepi. She has lived in the desert at Saqqara South for 4,200 years. She lives now in this account in the full recognition that the evidence demands and that the popular silence has too long withheld. She lives in the understanding, now available to anyone who has listened this far, that the wall hieroglyphs in a ruined burial chamber in the desert south of Cairo represent one of the most consequential single steps in the history of the ancient Egyptian religious tradition. The steps are there, in the stone, in the oldest surviving religious literature in the world. Her name was Ankhnespepy II, and now you know it.